Great to see so many wonderful names popping up. If you would like to introduce yourself, please do so in the chat. We'd love to hear where you're coming from, maybe what your role is. And also, while you're joining, we'll also share with you the links to the slides. Sometimes it can be easier to follow when you have the slides yourself. So I'll just copy and paste here the link so you have it. And you can go ahead and download that handout. We'll refer to that a few times today, and that handout will be useful. Thanks, Lois, for following along. Good to see that we see someone from Saudi Arabia, from Nigeria, from Tanzania. So the Ghana Exchange certainly has a broad reach. So welcome everybody to this session today. Great, so we're still just waiting for one more of our panelists to join. Thanks to everyone who's already started introducing themselves in the chat. As we mentioned at the beginning, you may also want to download the handout for today. That's the slide deck that we're going to be sharing today, and a few extra slides for your own review. So feel free, if you haven't already, to go to the SSE's website, and you can download that directly from our website. While we're waiting for Abena to join us today to give us opening remarks, I'm going to maybe go into the housekeeping since we have quite a few people here already. So I'm going to skip forward a couple slides here and just go over a few housekeeping topics with all of you. So thanks so much for being here with us today. Great, thanks, Frank. We're very pleased to have you with us today, and we're looking forward to interacting with you throughout this session. Now, you might have noticed that you are all on mute, and also your videos are turned off, and that's simply so that we don't have any interruptions throughout the training. It doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. We certainly do. So in order to communicate with us, please make use of the Q&A box. We have a number of experts here with us today, and they're here to answer your questions. So whatever has been blocking you from moving forward, any concerns you have, any questions, please feel free to ask those throughout today's session at any point, because we'll have somebody presenting like I am now, but at the same time, somebody will be answering your questions in the background. So don't hesitate to ask any questions you have. You'll also notice that you'll be able to see other people's questions. So if somebody else has asked a question that's particularly interesting to you, rather than retyping it, you can simply upvote their question and give it a thumbs up, and that'll bring it to the top of the list for our experts. Also, a few things about today's workshop is we do have a long afternoon together today. We're together for about 3.5 hours. Throughout that whole time, as I mentioned, there's a live Q&A, so please ask any questions that you have throughout our training today. We do expect you to participate today, and participation is not only by asking questions, but also we're going to have a number of Zoom polls that you can use. And in those Zoom polls, we will hear from you. Some of them are quizzes. Some of them are more your opinion and seeing what you're doing. So we look forward to hearing from you through those Zoom polls. We're also going to be using a tool called Mentimeter. And in that tool, we're going to also ask for your comments and your input on various aspects of what we're talking about today. So please do remain active with us today. If you are joining on a mobile device, you might want to grab a computer and also join on a computer so that you can make use of these tools. And to reward you for that, we will provide you a feedback or a certificate at the end. We just require you to fill in a feedback survey, and we'll share a link to that at the end of today's session. Now, before we move on, Diana, are we ready to go with opening remarks, or do we need a bit more time?
We yet to get information from him. How do you want to do it? Do we do the opening remarks now or we do it in between? If we have to do it now, Frank is on standby.
It's up to you guys. Frank, do you want to say some quick words? And then when Abena joins, we can always pause the training for a moment and come back to Abena.
Yes.
Great. The floor is yours.
Go ahead.
Yes,
Hello?
all yours, Frank.
Yes, a very good morning to all invited guests and distinguished guests here in Ghana. Permit me to give a short opening remarks for this program. As you may be aware, Ghana Stock Exchange is very proud to collaborate with SSE and other partners to put together this important short program. I also commend all invited guests here for making time to be part of this program and this important training. As you may be aware, businesses across the world have moved beyond just profitability and are focusing on the impact of their operations on a larger community, and this requires some level of transparency. Sustainability reporting has been embraced by organizations in various sectors to contribute towards the campaign for sustainable world for generation now and thereafter. The exchange has collaborated with all institutions all over the world, including the African Stock Exchange, the Swiss State Secretariat. The exchange has also launched ESG disclosure manual and is poised to lead the sustainability agenda in Ghana. As you may be aware, way back in 2023, IFRS issued the IFRS 1 and 2, which the Ghana Institute of Chartered Accountant has adopted and is seeking to implement it as soon as possible. And they have established a 3-phase stage for this implementation, 2026 being the stage where there's going to be some level of compulsory adoption. This is important so that this program is important so that all of us comes abreast of the knowledge and the skill required as far as the implementation of the IFRS standards on sustainability is concerned. I won't take much of your time. I will pause here and I look forward to a very successful training program. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Frank, and thanks for joining us today. And thanks to you and your colleagues for organizing this session today. Just as a reminder to everyone, we're hosted today by the Ghana Stock Exchange, who has invited all of you, and it looks like their reach is far beyond Ghana. We're seeing participation from all over the African continent. So welcome, everybody. And we're looking forward to joining you today for this 3.5-hour session. A quick introduction to who we are, who the Ghana Exchange invited to join this workshop today. My name is Tiffany Grabsky. I am the SSE Academy Head, and I'm joined today with Lois Guthrie, who's our Senior Specialist. Thanks so much, Lois, for being here with us today. We're also joined with two of our experts from the IFRS Foundation. We have with us already Bella Cheng, who's Capacity Building Specialist and seconded to the IFRS Foundation. Plenty of experience from Bella in reporting and disclosing, especially from an advisory perspective. So she'll have lots of insight to share with you today. And we're going to have with us joining a bit later, Jarlath Malloy, who's the Director of Strategic Affairs at the IFRS Foundation, and also has many years of reporting within organizations, as well as doing the reporting now for the IFRS Foundation. So plenty of insights there. As I said, we're here to answer your questions. So if you do have any questions for us, please don't hesitate to ask those in the Q&A. Now, as we dive in today, I just want to highlight a few of our learning objectives. So we do have a few things we want to achieve today with you. The first is that we hope we help you to understand what are these ISSB standards, or the International Sustainability Standards Board, and our second objective is how do you use those standards? What use are they? So we'll spend a lot of time on looking at the standards themselves, S1 and S2, which we'll dive into more deeply. But our two objectives is help you understand what they are and how you can use them. Now, our third objective is to help you to identify what steps can then be taken to develop your own disclosure plan. Now, you might be at various different levels of the company in different teams. And what's interesting about these standards is the need to work together. So everyone should play a part in developing a plan within the organization on how to meet the requirements of the standards and how to enhance your corporate disclosure. So we'll work together with you, and we'll actually give you a homework assignment that you can do on your own, working on creating a disclosure plan. So to achieve that, we've broken down the training into 4 modules. So the first module on preparation will be a quick review, helping everybody get on the same page, making sure everyone understands what the case for and the purpose of sustainability reporting is, and also how this landscape of standards and reporting frameworks has evolved. With that, we'll dive into module 2, which looks at alignment and particularly how do you align your company's disclosure to the standards. And then considering the ISSB standards as a global baseline for disclosure of sustainability related information, how then do you add to that with other frameworks and standards that can work together with the ISSB standards? Once we're all clear then about what those standards include and how to get started on them, we'll look at the actual implementation. So how do you go about identifying, evaluating, and integrating those sustainability related risks and opportunities? And then our final module, module 4, is how do you communicate that? And we'll look at the location of your communication, efficiency, and enhancing user confidence. A quick look at our agenda today. As I said, it's a 3.5-hour workshop today. We only have a short break halfway through. We have a lot of content to get through today. We really want to make sure we achieve those objectives and that the ISSB standards are crystal clear. So we just have a quick 5-minute stretch break halfway through, more or less. So if at any point you need to stand up and move around during the training, this is the joys of Zoom. You can get up and move as you wish. And we hope that you are able to follow the full program with us. If you do, we will provide you with a certificate at the end of the session. Now, as we've shared in the chat, and maybe Lois, you can share this again with everyone, we do have the training materials already on our website, and you can go ahead and download those whenever you wish. So you can download the slide deck that we're using today. That handout we're giving you, the slide deck actually has a few extra slides that you can review on your own time. And it also has that homework assignment I was mentioning that you can, again, do on your own time. The homework assignment is to develop a draft disclosure plan for your organization using what we learned in today's training workshop. But also we're going to do that together. So we're going to work on various activities after each module. We'll ask you to think through a few key questions to get you already started thinking about what a good disclosure plan should have. Now, a few extra tools we want to flag. So the SSE does have an ISSB toolkit. And in that toolkit, we have a model guidance, which really breaks down the standards and everything we're talking about in our training today. So if you need kind of a written module to go along with this training, you can use that model guidance, which we developed for stock exchanges to guide their markets on this topic. You may also want to use our training tools, which include one on transition plans, one on disclosing climate-related metrics, as well as our gap analysis checklist. All of these can help you on your journey. So you can find that toolbox through that QR code or the link that Lois just shared in the chat box, and you can use that to advance your learning journey. Each of them just has kind of more simplified guidance and points you in the right directions of additional resources you can use. In particular, I'll highlight the gap analysis checklist, which really simplifies the standards. It, of course, by no means replaces the standards, but it helps you kind of wrap your mind around exactly what's required and check your own disclosure to see what might be missing. So you might find that as a useful tool as you get started. Now, to kick us off today, I'm actually going to share my screen, and we're going to start. Oh, I see actually we have a Benna here. Abena, if you'd like to, you're welcome to do some opening remarks now. We'll see if you're managing to get your microphone connected. I'll give you a second to see if you are able to connect. It looks like potentially not, so I'm going to give me 2 seconds here and I will share.
Hello.
Ah, Abena, I hear you. Or is that
No,
Diana?
Abna, yes, this is Diana. Abna is joining right away. So we just spoke. She's joining right away. So
No problem. We'll give her a second.
okay.
In the meantime, maybe what I'll do is, Lois, can you share in the chat? Great. Thanks, Lois. How everyone can join the Mentimeter. As I said, we're going to use Mentimeter in order to interact with all of you. And that's something that we hope helps us hear from you a little bit. So if you use that link that was shared in the chat, you will be brought to our Mentimeter. And let me start presenting it. And I'll share. Here, so you should, a few of you have accessed it, so you should be able to see the Mentimeter here, and it says in 3 words, tell us why you joined today's training. So this is just to hear a little bit from you and also to get you using this program to make sure that everybody can use it. So you can use that QR code that's on your screen, or you can use the link that Lois shared in the chat. And that will help you to be able to go to a web page that asks you this question in 3 words, tell us why you joined today's training. I see a few of you have accessed it, about 10, but we have over 200 in this session. So if you're having trouble accessing it, please let us know. Now, why you're all here so far, it looks like to build capacity, so that's great. But I also see employability. So some of you are realizing that this knowledge is also important as you advance in your career journeys. Some networking, building practical advice, gaining wisdom, knowledge, great. So these are all things that we can definitely help you with. Again, if you are having trouble accessing this Menti, please don't hesitate to let us know in the chat. Great. Now, one more question for you we'll try out is, how comfortable are you with each of these tasks? So how comfortable are you explaining to team members what the ISSB is? So how well do you understand the ISSB? How comfortable are you using the ISSB standards if you've already started? And how comfortable are you developing a sustainability reporting strategy? So strongly disagree means you're not comfortable at all with this particular topic, and strongly agree means you're very comfortable, and you can go anywhere in between there. It looks like the very first person who filled it out was incredibly comfortable with these topics, but ever since it's been looking like the trend is moving downward. So we're going to leave that for you to fill in for a minute there so that we can then test you again at the end and see if we've improved at all on your comfort on these topics. Diana, while people are filling that in, should we see if Abena is able to connect?
Can you see her? She told me she was getting.
I do not see her.
Okay,
but I
so
see
let's
her.
go on. I'm sure
I hear
she
her.
would
I
get.
hear her.
You can hear her now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Hello. Good morning,
Hi.
everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, Abena, thank you
Yeah, I
so
can
much for
hear you
joining us.
too.
For those that are just joining, we have the managing director of the Ghana Stock Exchange with us today. Sorry, Abena, that there's been so many connectivity issues, but the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and a pleasant morning to everyone. And thank the over 200 people that have joined us. I see the numbers are still growing. For us at the GSC, this is a very important discussion for us to bring to the market. And thank you to our partners, UNSSC, for bringing us this important training. As you can see from the responses, many people are believing that these discussions, this training will help them strengthen their understanding of reporting according to ISSB and will improve their employability as well as the value they create to the market. For us at the GSE, it's important that ESG and reporting is at the forefront of everything we do, because it's the only way our market development will be sustainable. That is why we thought it was important to build the capacity of market participants and all of us get ready to do more in terms of reporting in line with the GSE's own ESG standards, as well as this new ISSB standard. So we're here to learn today. We're here to listen to the facilitators.
I think we
I wish all of us, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Irena. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to you and your team for inviting us to provide this training for you. With that, I think we're going to dive straight into the content. I just want to give a brief disclaimer. I'll leave this on the screen for everybody to see, but just to note that the way we're going to be using examples today is simply to actually do a lot of the things that you mentioned in the Mentimeter there and that Abina was mentioning, really to help build knowledge and expertise. Any of the examples we use are not being endorsed by any of our organizations, and they're really just to start to show kind of what companies are doing so you can start to learn from your peers. Please keep in mind, every organization is different though. So you're going to have to go about this journey however best suits your organization. So just because one company might do something one way does not mean that that's the right or the best way for your organization. So just keep in mind as we share examples that they're not necessarily endorsements, but they're really just to help you see some different options of how companies might already be doing this. And with that, I'm going to get started now in the first module, which is building a solid foundation of knowledge. And in this module, we're going to be looking at three particular aspects: the purpose, the landscape, and a global baseline. And we're starting today with purpose as our first unit in this module, where we'll look at the case for and market drivers for sustainability reporting. And to kick us off with that, I'm going to launch a poll here. Here we go. So popping up on your screen now, you should see the question: what are your reasons for disclosing sustainability related information? Now, some of you might not be disclosing this information already, in which case that last option F is completely fine. You can just say you're not disclosing sustainability related information yet. But if you are, what might be the reasons? And you can pick more than one. Is it because of regulatory requirements? Is it for sharing your management's objectives? Is it peer pressure, so societal expectations? Is it for investor interest? Or perhaps there are some other reasons. And if you do have other reasons, we'd love to hear them. So please feel free to put those in the chat. I also noticed there are, thanks Diana for pointing it out, there are some hands raised. If you do have a question, please ask that in the Q&A. We won't be unmuting any mics, but if you have a question at all, you can put that in the Q&A, or if you have a comment or you're struggling to see something, go ahead and put that in the chat box. Now I'm going to share the results of this poll. And what it looks like here is that quite a few of you, about a third of you already are not yet disclosing information. But that probably means that 2/3 of you are already disclosing sustainability related information. And it looks like the two number one top joint reasons for that is both regulatory requirements as well as investor interest. But some of you also see that there's societal expectations. Maybe your peers are already doing this, or perhaps your clients are expecting it. Also, you want to share your management's objectives. Now, while all of these are good reasons, I think it's important to look at them kind of holistically. And ideally, you get to a point where you're looking to meet all of these requirements. including regulatory requirements and investor demand, as well as ensuring that you are sharing your management's objectives. Great. I also see a great comment in the chat. How come there isn't an option that says it is just the right action to take? Well, I think that would be sharing management's objectives. So if your management, if your organization just understands that it's important to be on top of these risks and opportunities, and that you are, then it's a great reason to be reporting it, because you want investors and other stakeholders to see that. So great. Thanks for all those answers. Let's dive a little bit further in and look at one of those top answers that we saw, which was investor interest. So you might be familiar with this organization, the Principles for Responsible Investment. And as you can see on this chart, there's now more than actually 5,000 signatories of this initiative, and they represent more than 121 trillion US dollars in assets under management. And these are all asset managers and investors that sign up to Principles for Responsible Investment, which means they're particularly interested in that sustainability information. So why are they interested in the information? I think that's really important to get through at the very start of our training, is the why component. Of course, as someone said in the chat, it is indeed in many cases, the right thing to do. Many companies might believe that they just want to share that information, but investor interest of this information actually comes down to financial impact. So this study, which you can look further into in that slide handout that we shared, we have a link in it so you can read it yourself, but it's of retail investors, and this was done by Morgan Stanley. And they found that the top driver for at least individual investors was to drive their interest in investing or in sustainable investing through financial performance. So that number one there, financial performance of sustainable investment, is what investors were really looking at here. So what do we mean by financial performance? Now, we're going to mention quite a few times financial performance, so let's review that quickly. It's important to remember that today we're talking about disclosing financially material sustainability-related information. And while we will discuss in more depth in this workshop what the word material means in this context, we wanted to be clear from the start what sort of financial effects investors are looking to have more information on. So let's start with the effects on a company's performance, which is often seen in the statement of profit or loss, or where we see the income or revenue and expenditures of a company. Sustainability-related risks and opportunities can have a financial effect by changing the revenue mix or total revenue of a company. If, for example, demand for products and services change, or production capacity is distributed differently or disrupted, as a few immediate examples. And we also could see substantial changes in expenditures if, for example, operating costs increase due to energy prices increasing, or a need for greater R&D expenditure to capitalize on sustainability-related opportunities, or other costs associated with deploying new practices. Now, you'll also probably hear us talk a lot today about effects on a company's financial position. So let's look at what that means as well. We can often see a company's financial position on their balance sheet, also known as a statement of financial position. So, for example, a company may experience changes to certain assets or liabilities due to climate or sustainability issues. And we might see changes to portfolio value, or we might see write-offs of certain assets that are damaged or need to be repriced. Another financial effect that should be documented is changes to financing and the cost of capital. And that can include, for example, insurance premiums that increase due to climate risks, as well as making use of new financing structures such as green bonds or social bonds. So let's see what this looks like in practice now. So as a reminder of the disclaimer we've discussed earlier, these examples we use today are simply to add some color to what we're talking about, and they don't necessarily represent the only or even the best way to go about disclosing or communicating sustainability-related information. But let's look at this example, which is an extract from the global energy company EDP's annual integrated report for 2023. And this extract shows the main potential impacts of climate-related risks for 2030 under two different scenarios, which they refer to in the green column on the right-hand side of the slide as AGG, which stands for as green as it gets, and that's broadly equivalent to the International Energy Agency's net zero scenario, and another one which they call SMT, or slow move towards transition. So this company has listed risks by category in the first column. So for example, regulatory and legal risks, market risks, technological and reputation risks, which you might recognize from the TCFD, or Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And in the second column of that table, they describe the main impacts of those risks and the business segment that will be affected, and the estimated financial effects expressed in ranges. Elsewhere in their report, they actually go into much more detail into each of these risks in its evolution since the last report, and also the mitigation practices in place. But just to highlight here this section, so you can see how quantification of something so far in the future sometimes, or perhaps unknown, can be approached using estimates and ranges. So as you can see here, they actually find a very similar financial impact for both of those scenarios that they looked at. But we can see where these greatest impacts are in either scenario, and that's in market risks. Now, before we move on to the next unit of this module, just to flag two important aspects of sustainability-related risks and opportunities, which are really essential to our understanding of them and our disclosure of them. So as you can see here from the latest Global Risk Perception Survey from the World Economic Forum, risks actually evolve over time. So something that may pose a significant risk 10 years from now, like we're seeing all those green boxes 10 years from now, might not be so high on our mind today, a few less boxes 2 years thinking out. So what's quite important for our disclosure is that if we're going to be prepared for those risks that we're expecting to arrive in maybe 5 or 10 or 15 years from now, we may then have to invest today in new practices or processes that mitigate negative impacts or increase our chances for positive impacts in the future, which means we may have financial effects before that risk actually comes to fruition. So keep in mind during our training the aspect of time. Another important aspect of sustainability-related and climate-related risks and opportunities is their interconnectivity. So this is also from the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report. And as you can see here, there are many connections between different types of risks. So all those different colors of bubbles are different types of risks. But as you can see, they're all very much connected. I highlight this because many people think that the two ISSB standards are actually separate standards, so that there's one for climate and one for other sustainability topics when we talk about S1 and S2. However, as you can see on this slide, all sustainability-related risks and opportunities are actually connected. And therefore, separating out one topic or theme does not actually remove these connections. It just gives us not the whole picture. So keep in mind, even though we have two standards, S1 and S2, in disclosing information about climate-related risks and opportunities in accordance with S2, preparers must also apply the requirements of IFRS S1 insofar as they relate to disclosure of information on climate-related risks and opportunities. So keep in mind these two things throughout our training today: time and timing, as well as connections and interconnectivity. And with that, I'm going to pass over to my colleague Lois, who's going to take you through the next unit. Thanks, Lois.
Thanks very much, Tiffany. Hello, everybody. So we've looked at why sustainability-related disclosure requirements have emerged, including because of the risk landscape and because of investor interest. But now we're going to look at how the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards have developed in the landscape of existing reporting standards. But before we do that, we're just going to ask you first what frameworks you're currently using. So a Zoom poll is going to come up on your screens, and we're asking you to select all that apply. Are you using CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, or are you using GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative Standards? Do you use integrated reporting, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, the UN Global Compact, or something else? Please, and you can indicate that in the chat, and I can see that somebody's already said that they're using PRI. That's useful to know. Thank you. We'll just give you a moment more to look at this question. There is a pattern emerging. Yes, so we've got a strong pattern. So I think we'll share the results here. And you can see that most of you are using the GRI, Global Reporting Initiative Standards. Second most popular is integrated reporting. We're going to be saying something about that a bit later. And then there are some people using the UN Global Compact, TCFD, and very few using CDP and SASB. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. And we're going to move on now to have a look at what is the IFRS Foundation and what is its structure. So the IFRS Foundation is a not-for-profit public interest organisation that was set up to develop high quality, understandable, enforceable and globally accepted accounting and now sustainability standards. So at the bottom of the screen, you can see that the IFRS Foundation hosts two independent standard setting boards. There's the International Accounting Standards Board, or IASB, that sets financial accounting standards, and those standards are in place in over 140 jurisdictions around the world. And then in 2021, the International Sustainability Standards Board, or ISSB, was established, and they released their first two standards, IFRS 1 on general requirements and IFRS S2 on climate, in 2023, and we're going to look at them in detail today. Now, the governance of these two standard setting boards is done by the IFRS Foundation trustees, and they in turn are accountable to a monitoring board of public authorities. And one last thing to mention is, of course, the IASB and ISSB work very closely together to ensure that their standards complement each other. So how did all this happen? What happened before the IFRS Foundation developed their standards in 2023, and how did it come about? Well, this slide shows the names and the logos of some of the organisations that have helped to develop sustainability reporting over the years. They've all contributed towards its evolution. In fact, although you see lots of different logos here, these organisations represented by the logos have a lot in common, but because there's so many of them, they have different frameworks, they have different objectives. It caused some confusion in the market that some people called an alphabet soup. However, this slide and the arrows on it is a story of simplification, a story of harmonisation. So right at the bottom in the middle, you'll see CDSB, the Integrated Reporting Framework, and SASB, and these three organisations have now been consolidated into the IFRS Foundation. So they no longer exist independently, but the work they have done has been absorbed into the IFRS Foundation. The TCFD's work has been adopted by the IFRS Foundation and is reflected in their standards, the ones we're going to talk about today. So effectively, the TCFD's work is now closed and the organisation is no longer operating. On the left-hand side, you'll see the Transition Plan Task Force very much focused on transition plan activities, processes and disclosure, and the IFRS Foundation has taken over disclosure-specific aspects of their work. On the right-hand side, CDP's questionnaire is now aligned with IFRS S2 on climate, And with GRI, the IFRS Foundation and GRI have a memorandum of understanding under which they commit to jointly identify and align their common disclosures. So you can see from this picture that here we have a picture of simplification and harmonization, but it is ongoing. It's not yet quite complete, but it's a promising story. So let's do another Zoom poll. It's a simple yes or no answer. You can only choose one answer. Companies who disclose using the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure recommendations automatically comply with the ISSB standards. Is this true or false? Let's give you some moments to have a think about this. Quite a divided opinion here, split almost down the middle. Right, we have almost 50% participation and a pattern emerging. So let's share the results, please, Tiffany. And you'll be able to see that 60% of people said it was true and 40% said it was false. So some uncertainty here, but actually the answer is it is false. You cannot assume that if you are applying the TCFD recommendations only, that you automatically comply with the ISSB standards. That's because although the ISSB standards are based on TCFD's work, they're not exactly the same. There are some differences that we're going to discuss. So if you use TCFD recommendations, you are going to be a long way towards complying with the IFRS S2 standard, but not all the way. So you just need, the main message from this poll is you just need to be aware that there are some differences between the TCFD and ISSB standards. So if we stop the poll now, we're going to move on to look a bit more at TCFD. Yes. On this slide, what we show you is a document. You can see the link to it on the slide. And this document explains the differences between the TCFD and ISSB. So as I said, the TCFD's work finished in July 2023, and the IFRS Foundation now has assumed responsibility for climate reporting. So the differences really, there are three types of differences. The first is that IFRS S2 uses different wording, but to capture the same information as the TCFD. So it's just a wording difference. The second difference is that IFRS S2 sometimes requires more detailed information than what it was in TCFD. So, for example, there's more detailed information required about the use of carbon credits if they're used. And finally, IFRS S2 has some additional requirements, and in particular, requirements about using industry-based metrics and disclosure topics to prepare information. So let's have a little bit more about the IFRS Foundation. One of the IFRS Foundation's objectives in setting up the ISSB was to develop a global baseline for sustainability-related disclosure. So that global baseline is designed to enable comparable and consistent sustainability disclosures across capital markets. So, but it doesn't mean that jurisdictions can't add something to those that global baseline. So the IFRS Foundation is working with jurisdictions around the world, as well as multi-stakeholder groups, to ensure that the global baseline can be used with additional requirements that jurisdictions or others might add to them. So the little picture you can see here of the little blue blocks is designed to show building blocks. And what it means is that jurisdictions and others can add requirements to the global baseline, provided, and companies can respond to all of those things, to the ISSB standards and to the additional requirements, as long as the information is not presented in such a way that it obscures what the ISSB standards ask for. So the sorts of things that could be added as well are GRI type information that seeks information for multi-stakeholder needs, and they can be added on to the ISSB standards that seek information for investors across global capital markets. So in summary, this global baseline approach means that there's a reduction of the need for duplicated information. You've got a globally consistent baseline of disclosures, but you can report additional information based on standards like the GRI in your reporting. Now, for this approach has had a lot of global backing. So following the launch of the ISSB standards in 2023, IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Commissions, announced that it endorses the ISSB standards. Now, IOSCO has got 130 members around the world, and IOSCO asked those members to consider how they can incorporate the ISSB standards into their regulatory frameworks. The Foundation is also working with other stakeholders on adoption of the ISSB standards, and we'll come to have a look at exactly what that means later. There's also ongoing work with audit standard setters like the International Auditing Standards Board to develop and enhance assurance standards that support sustainability disclosure assurance. As I said before, the Foundation is working with multiple jurisdictions around the world to work with them to see the pathway towards adoption of the ISSB standards into international laws or other frameworks. Of course, the standards can also be adopted on a voluntary basis, and this training program is actually part of the mechanism for supporting that as well. So I'm going to hand over now to our colleague Bella, who's going to take you through the next part of the session.
Thanks, Lois. Right. We've talked about the business case and the market case for sustainability reporting, the evolution of the landscape, and how it's being simplified and rationalized. Now let's introduce IFRS S1 and S2 with a high-level overview of the standards that form the global baseline for sustainability reporting. Let's first look at a few terms. It's important to note that there are certain key terms that should be understood. You can find the definition in your handout, but I wanted to flag a few important things before we dive in. First of all, we'll be saying the phrases sustainability-related financial information quite a lot. We are simply referring to a broad set of issues, including climate, nature, or biodiversity, social aspects, etc. Sustainability-related financial information is information about a company's sustainability-related risks and opportunities, which is useful for investors to make decisions about providing resources to the company. And sustainability-related risks and opportunities are those that could reasonably be expected to affect the company's cash flows, access to finance, and the cost of capital. So in short, sustainability-related risks and opportunities that could affect the company's prospects. We will also often refer to the general purpose financial reports, which includes a company's financial statements and the management commentary. You might know this as a management report, a management review, or a strategic report. Some regulators require specific disclosures in certain parts of general purpose financial reports. So we use this generic phrase throughout. Okay, in this slide, well, you can see the core content areas. Anyone familiar with TCFD will recognize the same 4 core pillars or content areas for the ISSB standards. These are governance, strategy, risk management, and the metrics and targets. For each core content area, there are a set of key disclosures to be addressed, and the standards provide very detailed guidance on these requirements. We will briefly discuss each of the 4 content areas in this training and highly encourage you to follow up and review the standards as part of your homework assignment. Now let's look at the IFRS S1 general requirements. There's a lot to understand, but you might be surprised that some of the detail is familiar. You will also see many of the conceptual foundations developed by the IASB in the ISSB standards. Let's now start with IFRS S1. The full title, General Requirements for Disclosure of Sustainability-Related Financial Information. This slide sets out key concepts in IFRS S1, and we will go through it all today. IFRS S1 sets out general requirements for the content and the presentation of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. If you are familiar with TCFD, you will see the same architecture applied through all the standards. S1 asks preparers to refer to and consider the applicability of the SASB standards and also other sources of further guidance to identify sustainability-related risks and opportunities, and identify material information. The SASB standards are organized by industry, enabling a company to identify sustainability-related disclosure topics and metrics applicable to its business model and operations. Finally, the standards can be used in conjunction with any accounting requirements. Yes, the scope of S1 is all sustainability topics except for climate, which is covered by S2. The second standard, S2, focuses on climate disclosures, building on the same foundations of S1. For example, it fully incorporates the recommendations of TCFD. It sets out the requirements for a company to disclose material information about its climate-related risks and opportunities. And it also requires the disclosure of both cross-industry and industry-specific information. In terms of climate-related risks, these include both physical and the transition risk, which we will come back to. Other specific climate-related disclosures are required, for example, on scenario analysis and GHG emissions. Preparers shall also refer to and consider the applicability of the industry-based guidance on implementing IFRS S2. This is organized by industry, enabling a company to identify climate-related disclosure topics and metrics applicable to its business model and operations. It is crucial that S1 and S2 are not standalone standards. They are a package and must be applied together. Even when a company is reporting only on climate-related risks and opportunities, the company must apply both IFRS S1 and S2. This is because IFRS S1 sets out parameters for the type of information that needs to be provided in order to be decision useful for investors. The FIRE presentation requirements require disclosure of relevant information about sustainability-related risks and the opportunities, while the physical representation requirements require complete, neutral, and accurate of those risks and opportunities. IFRS 1 also explains the concept of materiality and how companies identify material sustainability-related financial information. In addition to the key terminology that I flagged a few slides back, I also wanted to pause here and note the conceptual foundations that underpin the ISSB standards. This helps to understand how best to disclose information in order to meet the requirements of the ISSB standards. To start with, one of the conceptual foundations is the requirement for a company to fairly present a complete set of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Fair presentation requires disclosure of relevant information and their physical representation. To achieve physical representation, companies shall provide a complete, neutral, and accurate depiction of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. The reporting entity conceptual foundation under IFRS 1 requires the reporting entity for sustainability-related financial disclosures to be the same as the reporting entity for the financial statements. Another important concept is connected information. What we saw earlier when explaining how different risks are often interconnected, the standards require companies to clearly identify key connections, such as those between risks and opportunities, connections between the four content areas, and connections between sustainability-related financial disclosures and the main financial statements. Now let's have a look at the example. Over to you, Lois.
Thank you, Bella. And we've chosen this example because it is an example of how companies connect different things. So this is an example from BHP's 2023 annual report, and BHP is an international mining company, and it shows three things being connected. The first thing is they're connecting their decarbonisation strategy with their investment process and decision making. So the company already has these two things, decarbonisation strategy and an investment process. And what they tell us in the first paragraph is that all investment decisions consider the quantity of GHG emissions associated with the project, the cost per tonne of CO2 equivalent associated with the project, and the alignment with the group pathways to a net zero trajectory. So investment decisions are connected with the decarbonisation strategy. That's the first thing. The second thing is the decarbonisation strategy is connected with various types of expenditure now and in the future. So you can see how much was spent on operational GHG emission reductions in the reporting year. And that was $122 million there in the second paragraph. And what the company anticipates spending, we see this in the third paragraph, up to the year 2030, and that is $4 billion. So that's the second connection, decarbonisation strategy and expenditure. The third is the connection between decarbonisation projects and the company's net present value. So based on current assumptions, the achievement of medium-term targets is expected to deliver a positive net present value, and to date, implemented projects have delivered positive or neutral net present value. So there's an example of the connections. And one last thing I'll point out is in the orange text at the bottom, you can see how the company navigates us towards further information if we need it. Back to you, Bella.
Thanks, Lois. Okay, so let's have a Zoom poll just to check whether you have an understanding of connection, the concept of connection, connected information. So choose the answers you think is right. What information should be considered for connected information between governance, strategy, risk management, and the metrics and targets, or sustainability-related financial disclosures and the financial statements, or sustainability-related risks and the opportunities. Okay, let's see how we did in this Zoom poll. Well, the right answer is all of these three are right. They are all connected information. Yes, I think more than half of you who answered this question have the right answers. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, finally, the standards are built on the concept of materiality as defined by the IFRS Foundation. We are going to go into this in more detail later, but just to highlight that we will be referring today to material information, which is information that if omitted, misstated, or obscured, could reasonably be expected to affect investor decision-making. During the SSB consultation on the exposure drafts, one of the key feedback topics was the importance of supporting preparers, particularly those with more limited resources and those in emerging markets. In addition to the standards and the application guidance published in 2023, a number of educational resources were also published, and since then others have followed, including the IFRS Knowledge Hub. We are also in the process of gathering examples and the case studies provided by our partners. The SASB standards were aligned with IFRS S2 to help preparers seeking industry-based guidance, and the IFRSA credential was also updated with more planned. I should also note that the IFRS Foundation's capacity building program, which is launched at COP27, is a key part of our support to preparers, and the ICC training initiative is one of our most important deliverables. Okay, so now let's take another Zoom poll. The question is, water is a vital input to your business, but the ISSB standards do not currently have a specific standards on water. What do you do? Yes, just remember that the IFRS S1 is general requirements, and the IFRS S2 is climate-related disclosure requirements. So now just choose which one you think is right. Okay, let's end the poll now. Okay, we'll see that just one choose the first answer, don't discuss anything about water. Well, in the question, water is a vital input to your business, which means this is material information for your sustainability-related risks and opportunities. So we can choose the first answer. We need to disclose related information on this topic. The right answer is the B. Consult the sources of guidance listed by ISSB. Just to remember that ISSB standards provide sources of guidance on topics rather than climate. You might think the option C and D is also helpful, but given this question, the B is the right answer. Okay. So now over to you, Tiffany.
Great. Thanks so much, Bella. And that actually brings us to the end of that first module. Hopefully we're now all on the same page. And before we do wrap up this module, I'm just going to take a few short minutes to review what we covered. So first, we reviewed the purpose of the sustainability related disclosures, and a key takeaway that we hope you leave this workshop with is that there are important benefits both internally and externally for collecting and disclosing sustainability related information. If you're not aiming to make good use of the data that you're collecting to improve strategic decision making, then you're actually going about all of this wrong, and you're wasting your time. So if you have operations in difficult to abate or high impact sectors, your competitors actually could disclose these risks and identify opportunities that they're pursuing, leaving your investors wondering why you're lagging, and that might affect your ability to raise funds. So do keep in mind why you're providing this information and make sure that you're always working towards those objectives. So next, we looked at the evolution of disclosure standards and the formation of the ISSB and the aim to simplify the landscape of sustainability standards. So as a reminder, the ISSB provides a comprehensive foundation of disclosure and that allows other building blocks of information, as Lois was explaining, to be added on top of ISSB disclosures to meet jurisdiction-specific requirements or broader multi-stakeholder needs, for example, impact disclosures or local requirements. So when you're thinking about other voluntary disclosures, you should not see them as competing with the ISSB standards, but rather building on top of them. And then finally, we introduced the standards and important concepts that you need to understand in order to use the standards correctly. So a key point I want to reiterate here is that these standards and the guidance that come with them are designed to meet needs of investors and therefore are heavily focused on prospects that we discussed at the very beginning of this unit. Now with that, let's quickly introduce the first activity in your homework assignment. Now, somehow we're already a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to go quite quickly through this activity. But you can work on this on your own time as well. So in your homework assignment, which is up to you if you'd like to do or not, we ask you kind of how you'll build collective capacity and identify the responsible individuals for your disclosure. And a few things we indicate you might want to keep in mind is the tone for the top, really starting at the top, who's going to be responsible, also the integration throughout, and then that negotiation within the teams, within your organization. So we're going to go back to a Mentimeter. I'll just share my screen here so you can see it. And some of you have already shared your thoughts on this. Again, it's actually the same Mentimeter as you had open before. So if it's still open in your browser, you can just go back to it. Otherwise, you can use that QR code or the link that we've shared in the chat. So what will you do to identify the skills and knowledge gaps in your organization and to meet the standards? This is really thinking about the people in your organization and the collaboration that needs to exist. So we see here skills gap and closing it because this is a specialized area. Indeed, to an extent, but what we found is because we're talking about risk management and opportunities, it actually involves most of your organization. So we need to make sure that we're not thinking of it too much as a specialized area, but rather understanding how these specialist skills can then be applied throughout the organization. We see training and specialized hiring. Indeed. So training all your staff, but then also there's certain areas where you're going to need to bring in new expertise, whether that's hiring consultant, hiring new staff, looking for certain skills in the staff that you are hiring, or upskilling your existing labor force. Someone says that they're a consultant, so they'll be helping others move through this. And certainly there's a lot of need for that, especially as you get started to identify kind of those gaps in what's needed. We see a lot of training and surveys. So the surveys are really great. First, you really need to understand what's missing before you can start any training. I mean, trainings like this are great to get an overview of exactly kind of the big level, high level picture. But when we get into the nitty gritty and people are actually integrating this into their jobs, we need to really understand what specific skills are missing, and that'll be unique to each company. So great. I think you've all understood that part of it very well. I'm going to come back to our slides now. And we'll continue then with our next module, and I'll pass back to Bella to get us kicked off. Thanks, Bella.
Thanks, Tiffany. Yes. Now that we have introduced the initial concepts, let's dive into how to apply the ISSB standards and integrate any additional disclosures, taking into account any relevant geographical or sectoral requirements, as well as peer practices and your leadership's objectives. Okay, in order to understand how to ensure your disclosures meet global disclosure standards, we will look at two key concepts in this unit. The first and the main focus of this unit will be on how to apply the standards to achieve a global baseline for disclosure. Once we cover that, we will also discuss what additional disclosures companies are considering. To begin, let's focus first on how to apply the ISSB standards as the global baseline. Let's get started on the first core content, governance. This includes aspects that relate to the governance body in your company and how management is applied. Okay, for each of the core content areas, we will discuss a list of questions that a reporting company could use to start identifying the information that supports meeting some of the disclosure requirements. For example, as part of a gap analysis of your current disclosure. So if we look at the governance and the management requirements, we can see that there are several that are fairly qualitative. For example, which bodies are responsible for the oversight and the management of processes, controls, and the procedures of sustainability risks and opportunities. For example, if management responsibility is delegated to a specific role or committee, how and when do they get informed about sustainability-related risks and opportunities? How these issues inform strategy, decision-making, and the risk management. This could include setting targets to manage sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Okay, whether progress against these targets linked to executive remuneration. For more information, you can make use of the ISSE checklist tool, but remember, it's not a replacement for reading and using the full ISSB standards. Let's take a look at a couple examples of this to see what we mean in practice. Now I'm going to pass over to Lois.
Thank you, Bella. So the first example we're going to look at is from a bank, Allied Irish Bank is a high street bank in Ireland with many sustainability credentials. But because we're a bit short on time, I'm just going to point out a few things about this example from their 2022 report, which is the way in which they describe their governance of sustainability matters. And the thing to note is that they've got 3 board committees that deal with this, the risk audit and business advisory committee, and each is supported by an executive subcommittee and management. So they use the kind of the 3 lines of defense model, where they have responsibilities from functions that own or manage risks, functions that oversee or specialize in the management of risk, and functions that provide independent assurance. And we're going to skip the next example in the interests of time. So I'm going to hand back to you, Bella, here. Oh, sorry, Tiffany. You.
I think I'll take over. We'll give Bella a bit of a break. She's been talking a lot. Thanks, Bella. Great. So let's move on then to the next core content area, which is strategy. Now, strategy has quite a few more disclosures to include than governance, but it's really where companies can see the benefits from sustainability-related opportunities and ensure they're prepared for the risks. So as you can see here, there are kind of 3 high-level areas that we focus on in the strategy content area, which are risks and opportunities, effects and resilience, and we will review each of these separately. So if we first start with the first high-level category, which is risks and opportunities, the IFRS S1 and S2 disclosure requirements on strategy are really designed to enable users of the general purpose financial reports to better understand a company's strategy for managing sustainability-related risks and opportunities. So if we look first at those risks and opportunities, these are some questions that you might want to be asking internally. So you might want to be asking, when disclosing information about risks, information required includes the description of the effects, the time horizon. So you want to ask, what are these effects, and what are the time horizons that we're talking about? Keeping in mind that financial effects can occur, of course, before, as we mentioned, the risk and opportunity materializes. The last 2 questions that you can see on this list in particular look at climate. So this aligns with the requirements from S2. So for example, investors also want to understand what types of risks or opportunities we're seeing, and we often see companies using the categories that we have been already discussing from the TCFD, such as physical or transition risks. And additionally, when disclosing on climate for S2, companies are also expected to use the IFRS industry baseline guidance. And this can often be a bit easier to understand with an example. So let's show quickly an example here from Gold Fields Integrated Annual Report of 2023. Now, Gold Fields is a diversified gold producer with mines in South Africa, Australia, Ghana, Chile, and Peru. So you might already be fairly familiar with them. In this extract on this slide, we can see which risks that the company has identified, how they've identified them using a prioritization matrix, and how those risks align with strategic priorities and what mitigation policies the company is using. So this goes a little bit beyond what we just discussed in those first few questions, but shows how they're all kind of interconnected. They do also include a lot more information about these risks throughout the report, but this is just a quick excerpt of it. Now, we mention time horizons. Another aspect of risks and opportunities that have been identified as having a potential financial effect that we need to be disclosing brings us really back to what we're discussing at the beginning with that time. Now, remember, I said that we need to keep that in mind throughout our training. And time factors can be something quite different than we're used to talking about now that we're discussing sustainability-related disclosures. So let's make sure we're quite clear on what we mean by these time horizons. So the standard does ask you to identify within what time horizon any material effects are expected to occur. And what's I think important to note is that definitions of short, medium, and long-term time horizons actually can vary greatly between companies, and they depend on many factors. So they can depend on your investment and business cycles or strategic planning horizons, the life of assets, or even some other factors. So what's really important to note is that this time horizon should be defined by you. So don't expect investors to know what short or medium term means. provide that quantitative definition. How many years or months are you talking about? And make sure it makes sense, because you're not going to plan a time horizon of risks and opportunities that don't fit with your business cycles and your strategic planning horizon. So making sure it makes sense within your industry and within your organization. Now, the second kind of grouping of disclosures in strategy category was on the current and anticipated effects. So given that the first section of the strategy component relates to identifying the risks and opportunities that could be reasonably expected to affect an entity's prospects, it's quite natural then that the next set of disclosures pertain to what exactly that effect is and where it occurs in that business. So to start tackling the disclosure requirements of the standards, companies might want to start asking themselves questions such as beginning to describe these effects and understanding the response planned for mitigating or adapting to the effects identified from sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Again, an example can bring more color, so let's look at what these questions would look like when they're disclosed. In this example, if I can change the slide here. There we go. So this example is from a global chemical producer, their 2023 annual report. And the company here acknowledges that their strategy is affected by the changing climate and scarcity of natural resources and pressure on ecosystems, as well as a growing population. And so as we've discussed in the first set of questions for strategy, they were able to show which risks and opportunities they expect to affect their company. Then furthermore, they explain these effects. So they say that their business, and they're in the chemistry business, has a key role to play in addressing those challenges that have been identified, including through innovation, through using raw materials more effectively, through reducing waste and enabling healthy food production and climate smart mobility. So as well as the changes that they hope that chemistry will offer society and the economy, the company itself will also need to undergo some quite profound changes. And they refer to these as transformations. And they describe here the transformations they expect all along their value chain. So they're shown in the excerpt that we include here, where we see that the company's supply chain, production, and products will all be affected and transformed in some way. Now let's go to the final grouping of our strategy disclosures. Now, sometimes one of the obstacles that companies face when reporting on these effects is to what detail they should be disclosed. Oh, we're not even moving quite yet into the next section. Let's look at how we disclose that information of those effects. And this is looking at qualitative and quantitative disclosures. So a company is required actually to disclose both quantitative and qualitative information about the current and anticipated financial effects of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. However, the standards also set out criteria for when only qualitative information is required. So just to quickly highlight when just qualitative information can be used. So using only qualitative information for current and anticipated financial effects is permitted in two situations. One, if a company cannot separate the effects of climate-related risks and opportunities from other effects, and two, if there is a high level of measurement uncertainty. Now, also for anticipated, so not current, but just anticipated financial effects, only qualitative information is permitted in one instance, and that's if the entity does not have the skills, capabilities, or resources to provide the quantitative information. So just keeping in mind that in certain instances, you can use just a description or qualitative information. Now, let's move on to that final set of, if I can move this line. I'll try here, there we go. Final set of questions. So this is our last part of the strategy component. The first part, remember, was looking at risks and opportunities that are going to affect the reporting company. And then the second part was, what is that effect? And now this group of disclosures looks particularly at how the company is prepared for uncertainties and ensuring its resilience into the future. Now, this really gets into practices and processes that a company has in place to assess its own resilience and to make strategic adjustments when it's needed. So disclosures include information on what type of assessments are used and how scenario analysis is used. And at the heart of it, resilience disclosure requirements ask an entity to disclose first its assessment of climate resilience, and second, the inputs and key assumptions that are used to make that assessment. So we'll dive deeper into what is a scenario analysis in a moment, but some questions you can consider asking internally when starting to disclose this information and looking at your company's resilience or its capacity to react or adjust to the uncertainties arising, and how different scenarios can be used to do that are on your slide now. But let's look at a couple of examples to see how this actually looks in practice. So this example is by coming from Stora Enso, which is a Finnish and Swedish forestry product company. And it shows us in this small diagram on the top right hand of your slide what sales are likely to look like in 2030. So Stora Enso distinguishes between essential and growth business in this very small but yet very powerful infographic. We don't really have any numbers here, but we have an immediate picture of where growth is anticipated and also detail about the company's long-term vision and their recent transition, which they describe in the text as proactively repositioning the business from largely a pulp and paper company to a renewable materials company, ensuring our future for many more years to come. So what this company is showing here is how they plan to react. What is their resilience and how are they going to make sure that as they've identified certain risks and opportunities evolving in the market, they're going to be prepared for those and they're going to evolve alongside it. I will, maybe we do have time, I think, to cover this one. So I will quickly look at this one as well. And this one comes from Solvay, which is a Belgian multinational chemical company. And we're using this example here to illustrate reporting those financial effects. And in particular, I want to highlight how they are really transparent about the estimates and note that they have been developed based on a scenario analysis. Now I mentioned we're not going to go too into detail right now on that, but as you can see here, they've used a scenario analysis in order to, like as a tool, in order to evaluate that resilience. Now, important to note that if you are going to use such a tool, if you're using a scenario analysis, what investors need to know is how you used it. So you can see in this excerpt that they actually note what assumptions they have used, indicating that they used a scenario analysis tool from a leading consulting firm to identify the assumptions used for their assessment. And they've also highlighted that internal experts worked together with the consultant and to conduct an assessment. So great to use external expertise, but who knows the company best more than yourself? So a company needs to also use its internal expertise for that. Now, I won't go into detail into what they found because we're just a bit short on time. But just to note, you can use this example to look at then how they took that scenario analysis and that assessment to then identify kind of what are their growth businesses, where are they going to invest in the future, and where do they see the company moving forward and addressing these concerns, and how resilient they expect to be. And in this case, it's a very positive story because they find that the main areas that they looked at are all going to be fairly resilient. Now, before I pass on to the next section, I'm going to do a quick poll with you all here. Just give me a moment to launch it. Here we go. Great. So three possible answers here. You can choose 1, 2, or 3 of them. The question is, a company may choose to disclose only qualitative information or descriptions, or a combination of information about current and anticipated financial effects when. Remember, this is just a couple of slides earlier. There were a few situations where you can provide just qualitative information if you are not able to provide the quantitative information. Option 1 is the company cannot separate the effects of climate-related risks or opportunities from other effects. The second option is they're at the high level of measurement uncertainty. And the third option is the quantitative information may shed negative light on the company. And I'll give you just a second to fill that in. Well, so far everyone's doing a great job. We'll maybe give a few more of you a chance to fill that in before I close it out. But for those who have already filled it in, you seem to be listening well. We'll give you 5 more seconds. Okay, let's see how everyone did. A big bravo, everyone. The majority of you are right. So the first 2 answers are indeed correct, but the third one is not. So if quantitative information sheds negative light, that's not a reason not to disclose it. Actually, it's probably material at that point. So what you should rather be doing is looking at how you are going to be resilient against that potential negative impact. So what is your company going to strategically do? And this is really where that information becomes very useful for strategic decisions and making sure that you're not just producing it to disclose, but also producing it to make strategic decisions. Great. So with that, we're going to move on to climate-specific considerations, and Lois is going to take us through that. Over to you, Lois.
Thank you, Tiffany. The requirements of S1 and S2 are quite similar in many respects. They're both based around these 4 content elements of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, as Bella has let us know. But some of the strategy considerations in S2 that are climate-specific considerations are a bit different. So we're going to take a look at those now. So some of the differences we're going to explain here, we're explaining because they're a bit different to TCFD, but broadly consistent. So you can use this, if you don't know TCFD, you can treat this as a list of things you need to consider in disclosures, or if you do know TCFD, you can use this to think about where there might be gaps in your existing disclosures. So, as I said, we've got this broadly consistent treatment of strategy between IFRS S1 and S2, but the climate standard requires a company to refer to and consider the applicability of industry-based topics. So, as well as cross-industry topics and metrics, this standard wants you to disclose things that are particular to your industry, and there is industry-based guidance, industry-specific guidance that accompanies IFRS S2, so you can refer to that. S2 also says that information should be given about where in the business model and value chain risks and opportunities are concentrated. So that might be where in terms of your processes or where geographically. They just want to know where the majority of risks and opportunities are concentrated. Thirdly, in describing the effects of climate-related risks and opportunities, information is required, for example, about how the company has responded to or plans to respond to those identified risks and opportunities. And this can include things like whether there's a transition plan, which is in part a response to climate risks. Then, as Tiffany's just explained to us, the standard S2 does set out criteria for when you can use quantitative or qualitative information. And in particular, S2 says that disclosure of qualitative information can be allowed, just qualitative, in some circumstances. For example, as Tiffany said, when a company cannot separately identify the effects of the risk or opportunity, or when the level of measurement uncertainty is too high. Moving on to the next point, the company is only required to use all reasonable and supportable information available at the reporting date without undue cost and effort to prepare their disclosures. And they can use an approach that is commensurate with the company's circumstances, their staffing levels, their resources, their expertise at the time of disclosure. So we've talked already about the fact that for the purpose of of assessing the company's resilience to climate-related risks, a company is required to use climate scenarios. But just to let you know, the standard does not specify which particular scenarios the company is to use. That is for the company to determine, but there is some guidance we refer to in your handouts that could be useful. And finally, there's additional information required about the resilience assessment when dealing with the climate standard. So in particular, a company is asked to disclose significant areas of uncertainty that it has encountered when conducting its assessment. It's required to disclose information about its capacity to adjust and adapt its strategy and business model over time, and also details about how and when the climate scenario analysis was carried out. So something we've just mentioned is transition plans. IFRS S2 requires a company to disclose any climate transition plan that it may have. There's not a requirement to have one, but if it does have a transition plan, it has to provide information about it. So let's look at what that information is. Well, first of all, the definition of a transition plan is an aspect of the company's overall strategy that includes targets, actions, or resources for the transition towards a lower carbon economy, including, for example, greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan. So because a transition plan is an aspect of the company's overall strategy, the climate transition plan must be aligned with that strategy, with the business case, with the business motivation and decarbonisation levers that are most economically and technologically feasible for the company, given its overall strategy and its transition plan. Secondly, the transition plan should be aligned with external factors. For example, might be science-based information about how the climate risks will emerge and what they will affect. What science says about net zero plans and targets and how they are to be achieved. You might be looking at international agreements like the Paris Climate Agreement and how your transition plan aligns with that. Next, the plan must include long-term transition goals supported by activities and targets to achieve those goals and interim milestones. So given the uncertainty about how the transition will unfold, it's important that the disclosures are transparent about what dependencies, risks, challenges are associated with the execution of the transition plan, and to explain how residual and unabated GHG emissions will be handled. It's really useful in developing your transition plan and making disclosures about it to have a look at some of the sector-specific pathways that have been developed by different organisations and how you align with that. We'll look at some resources in a moment. And finally, companies should consider how the transition plan will be evaluated and how to give it the hallmarks of credibility, which are set out in various guidance documents. Now, talking about guidance documents and resources, on this page you can see on the right-hand side some thumbnails of the covers of some publications from GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. In the middle three documents, they set out pathway expectations for real economy companies and financial institutions, but their work also includes some of the sector pathways that I mentioned to you earlier. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a thumbnail of the work on the Transition Plan Task Force, and in particular their disclosure framework. But TPT also has a lot of other resources that you can look at to help with transition planning. Now, on the left-hand side, you can see this pyramid is designed to indicate that the publications and work by the TPT and by GFANZ are designed to help companies to conform with the IFRS sustainability disclosure requirements on transition plans. So in summary, all of these things are designed to work together to help companies with their transition plans. Now, you'll be very glad to hear that we're going to have a short break. It will just be 5 minutes. So please do continue to submit your questions, but have a good stretch, go and get a drink, and we'll see you again in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good break. We often play some soothing music during the break, but people have told us it starts to send them to sleep, so perhaps best not to. So welcome back, everyone. We're going to move on now to the next core content, the third one, which is risk management. So as you can see from the high-level overview here, this category of disclosures requires report preparers to disclose information about the process they use for risk management, as well as how that fits into their overall risk profile. We had a question earlier about, the use of the enterprise risk management framework. And so, of course, what we're looking for here is information about how your risk management processes fit in with that and what those processes are. So let's go on to look at what sorts of questions you might want to evaluate as you consider how to answer questions and make disclosures about the company's risk management process for sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Well, questions that can help identify the key information that can assist you in making those disclosures include things like what processes and policies are being used to identify, assess, prioritize, and monitor sustainability-related risks and opportunities. What are the inputs and parameters for risk management? How do you prioritize the risks and opportunities? How is the nature, likelihood, and magnitude of the risks assessed, and so on? This applies to both risks and opportunities. And then, as I said, how is sustainability-related risk and opportunity management integrated into the company's overall enterprise risk management process? As we said when we answered the question about this earlier, sustainability-related risks and opportunities have different characteristics to other risks in terms of the time horizons over which they are expected to materialize and in terms of their uncertainty, and therefore the overall risk management process might need to be adapted accordingly. So now let's look at some of the climate-specific considerations about risk management. So this is from S2. So you'll have to provide more details on the inputs that are used to identify and assess risks and opportunities for climate disclosure purposes. So the disclosure requirements in S2 are broadly consistent with the TCFD if you're using that, but S2 requires more detailed information about those input parameters used to identify risks, whether and how climate scenario analysis has been used to inform risk identification, and whether risk management processes have been changed or adapted for climate, as I described earlier. Additional disclosures are also required on the processes used to identify, assess, prioritize, and monitor opportunities, and also how that opportunity management is integrated into the company's processes. So as at the bottom, you can see the comparison again between S2 and TCFD, if that helps. Now, part of identifying risks, of course, is being aware of what types of risks and opportunities you should be evaluating to begin with. So TCFD specified types of climate-related risks and opportunities, as well as examples of financial effects they might lead to. So we can, there is more information about this, of course, in the ISSB standards and guidance, but basically risks are identified and defined as transition risks and physical risks. So transition risks arise from efforts to transition to a lower carbon economy, and they're often categorized in turn as policy and legal, technological, market and reputational risks. There are some examples in the middle of the slide that I'll leave you to look at. But the important point here is that any of those risks can give rise to financial effects. Similarly, with physical risks, they are defined as acute, that is, physical risks arising from weather-related events such as storms, floods, droughts, and heat waves, they are increasing in their severity and frequency, or chronic physical risks that arise from longer-term shifts in climatic patterns, so changes in precipitation and temperature, which lead to sea level rise or reduced water availability, biodiversity loss, and changes in soil productivity. And again, we have examples in the middle of how those risks might affect a company in terms of, say, increased costs of raw materials, and in turn, how they can give rise to financial effects that affect the company's cash flows, access to capital, and cost of capital over different time horizons. Similarly, the IFRS S2 standard, building on TCFD, also defines and gives examples of climate-related opportunities. Climate-related opportunities can be those associated with resource efficiency, changing energy source, developing products and services that cater to the demand from consumers for more sustainable products, finding new markets, or increasing the company's resilience. So it might give you a first mover advantage. And I think investors are often particularly interested in the types of opportunities that a company is exploring. We have examples of the types of opportunities that might arise in the middle of the slide, as I said, differentiating yourself against competitors, accessing new markets, finding use for new sustainable technologies. And again, all of these opportunities can result in financial effects on the company's cash flow, access to finance, cost of capital over different time horizons. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jarlath now, who's joined us to replace Bella, and Jarlath's going to take us through an example.
Thanks, Lois. Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. My name is Jarlath Malloy. So we have this example here to illustrate some of the points Lois was just talking about. NATS is the UK air navigation service provider. It handles UK domestic and North Atlantic air traffic control. Many of us will know how bad weather already causes delays for airlines and airports, and of course ourselves as passengers. And this can often lead to increased CO2 emissions due to aircraft circling in holes or even being diverted as airspace becomes congested and inefficient. Now, we know climate change is driving increased frequency and severity of bad weather events. For example, it could be thunderstorms in the summer or even turbulence. While on the ground, extreme temperatures, flooding, and winter storms all affect airports and network infrastructure. However, longer-term changes to the climate patterns may influence the jet stream, and that could shorten times for some intercontinental journeys. Now, this disclosure example provides important details on how this particular risk was assessed and how it was deemed to be material for NATS's stakeholders. Building physical and operational resilience will need to be addressed in its strategy and also in its long-term investment plans. So we'll now spend some time reviewing the disclosure requirements on metrics and targets in the standards in a little bit more detail. And this is the final core content area of the standards, obviously. So let's start with metrics and look again at some of the key conversations that should be happening internally in your organization to inform your disclosures. Requirements on metrics are designed to enable investors to understand your company's performance in relation to your sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Preparers shall disclose information explaining how the metrics are defined, if they're absolute or relative, if they've been validated by a third party, as well as the methodology that was used. So, for example, what was the method of calculation? What were the inputs? Are there any limitations? And what kind of assumptions were involved? And therefore, some questions that can be asked perhaps internally in your organization involve considerations around the metrics being used, how they're being defined and calculated, and how performance is being tracked over time. The standards also provide detailed guidance on how to ensure metrics are useful for investors. So, for example, metrics should, in the end, help report users to be able to better understand your organization's performance in relation to its sustainability-related risks and opportunities. And these are expected to vary depending on the industry and the industry-based guidance. And for example, which the SASB standards can provide more information on. And these are available on the IFRS website. Metrics can also be taken from a source other than the ISB standards. For example, you could have industry developed guidance within an industry association or trade body. And of course, it can be developed in-house if that's been done already, as long as these meet the other requirements that have been set out. Now let's move on to the second part of this category, which is targets. And targets are usually set by the company, but in some cases they might be required by law or regulation. And for each target, the company may have to start asking internally some questions to be able to disclose the information required by ISSB, such as whether the target is qualitative or quantitative, and whether it's been set voluntary or by law or regulation, as I mentioned. It will also have to consider the metric used to set those targets, as well as how it will monitor progress towards achieving that target over time. Of course, we'll need to see the baseline period for whatever target is being used and tracked, as well as the end date. You know, what's the goal? What's the end point of the target? And in some cases, targets can be quite long term. So you might expect to see interim targets or milestones along the way to indicate progress. And of course, if there have been any revisions to the target for whatever reason, we should see an explanation of those, as well as obviously those revisions being disclosed. And these questions can help you just get started on making sure you have the key information that will help you meeting some of these requirements. And Lois is going to take us through some examples next.
Yes, thanks, Charles. Thank you. We're going to start with an example from ArcelorMittal's 2022 annual report. ArcelorMittal is a multinational steel manufacturing and mining company. And this example is to show you how they set out information both about metrics and targets, or an extract from how they do that. So in this report, we see that first, the company has an ambition. It wants to have a leadership position within the steel industry and to achieve net zero steelmaking globally by 2050. So we know from that ambition that we should expect some metrics and targets to support that ambition. So they do tell us what their targets are. They want to reduce carbon emissions intensity by 25% globally and 35% in Europe by 2030. And they tell us that these targets cover scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions for steel and mining per ton of crude steel. So we can see what the targets are, we can see they're different for the global and European sections, and we can see what scope the targets cover. They also tell us that they have a roadmap which they set up from 2021, so that we know that their targets and ambitions take place within the context of that roadmap that says how they're going to achieve their medium-term targets to 2030 and their commitments to 2050. We also see what investments they're putting into achieving this, which is an anticipated gross investment of $10 billion. On the right-hand side, we see something about their assumptions, but also dependencies for success of these targets. So one of the things they say they need, for example, is a supportive policy landscape to achieve their objectives. And there's lots more information about this in their report. We're going to move on now to look at some of the climate-specific considerations relating to metrics and targets. So again, for those people using TCFD, really focusing on how IFRS S2 is different. One of the main differences is that S2 requires disclosure of industry-based metrics relevant to the company's business model and activities. As we said earlier, there is specific guidance to help you with this, the S2 industry-based guidance. And the important thing to note is that the company is required to disclose these industry-based metrics based on the guidance that is referenced in the standard. There are also what are called some cross-industry metrics, so they apply to all companies. So they include disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions. And those greenhouse gas emissions are to be presented in a particular way that we'll come on to. IFRS S2 also says that Scope 3, as well as Scope 1 and 2, Scope 3 emissions must be disclosed, and there is a Scope 3 measurement framework within S2 to explain how to prepare Scope 3 disclosures. Now, S2 does not explicitly require a company to disaggregate its GHG emissions by the different Kyoto constituent gases. However, it does contain requirements on disaggregation that would be needed if such disaggregation provided material information. So if there was a material amount of methane emissions, for example, they should be disaggregated. So I'd like to just remind you, as Tiffany said earlier, we've got toolkits on the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative website, and there is actually a training tool on climate metrics and sustainability metrics on the SSE's website in the link we provided to you earlier. So let's have a little look now at the requirements on targets that are, based on TCFD, but add to that. So the first thing is that S2 says that a disclosure is required about how and whether the latest international agreement on climate change has informed the target. So this could be the Paris Agreement, and if updates to it if they happen, and whether the target has been validated by a third party. S2 also requires disclosure of more detailed information about your GHG emissions targets, including information about how the company plans to use carbon credits to achieve the targets that they've set. Finally, S2 requires additional information about the approach to setting and reviewing each target and how progress is monitored towards that target, including whether the target was derived using a sectoral decarbonisation approach, and we looked at some of the sectoral guidance earlier in the presentation. So let's just move on now to look at GHG emissions targets. As I said before, in S2U, there are cross-industry metric requirements. Greenhouse gas emission metrics, Scope 1, 2, and 3 is the first of those cross-industry metric requirements. So to those of you that might not be familiar with this terminology, it comes from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And very briefly, Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions refer to all direct emissions that occur from sources owned or controlled by the company. So from your own facilities, plants, or vehicles. Scope 2 refers to indirect emissions from the generation of purchased energy, energy that is acquired, purchased and consumed by the company, electricity, steam, heating and cooling. So the electricity you buy, very simply. Scope 3 is then all other indirect emissions that occur in the company's value chain. And there's a particular way of analysing Scope 3 emissions that's referred to in the guidance. S2 also asks companies to disclose these greenhouse gas emissions and calculate them using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Standard, unless the jurisdiction within which they operate requires them to use a different method. So where a company is required by law to apply a particular method, that will supersede the requirement in the standard to use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. There's also a requirement on disclosing any climate-related considerations that affect executive remuneration. So, for example, where that remuneration is dependent upon the achievement of the types of targets that we have discussed. Let's go on to look at a little example then. This is from an example from Enel, which is an Italian electric utilities company. It's from their 2022 sustainability report. And you can see lots of little illustrations here. Let's start at the top of the page. Here you can see the company's carbon footprint and how they have disaggregated or broken down the GHG emissions by scope. So they're reporting the scope 1, 2, and 3 separately and then totaling them at the far right end of the diagram. So you can see by comparison there that the majority of emissions come from scope 3 sources. The other thing you can see on the top of this diagram is that you get this distinction or this trend between 2021 emissions in the light green bars and 2022 emissions in the darker green bars. Let's move on to what they're saying at the bottom of the page. And here you can see how the scope 1 direct emissions are broken down between the business lines of generation, trading, networks, end customers, and others. And you can see immediately from the green bars that the majority of scope 1 emissions come from generation from thermal sources. There's lots more we could say about this diagram, but just one thing to draw to your attention. The little dots we see near the numbers, they refer to whether and to what extent the GHG source is included within a science-based targets initiative target, so whether it's informed by targets. So these two little diagrams give us a lot of information about greenhouse gas emissions. So with that, let's move on to another poll here. And I think you can select all that apply. The question is, what is the objective of the metrics disclosure requirements? Is the objective to enable report users to understand the company's performance in relation to its sustainability-related risks and opportunities, to understand progress towards any targets, or to understand the company's assumptions for the future? So great to see so many of you still participating. We're only about 3 minutes over time, so I'm going to give you a minute more here, or a second more. Yes, we can see a pattern emerging here, so I think we'll end the poll and share the results, please. And you can see that the majority of people have answered A and B. Now, they are the correct answers: to understand performance in relation to the entity's risks and opportunities, and to understand progress towards targets. Now, of course, the metrics and the targets might help the reader understand the company's assumptions for the future. So it's not an incorrect answer in that sense. However, what we're trying to draw your attention to here is that in the standard, the objective of each disclosure requirement is set out at the start of the requirements. And specifically, the standard says that the objective of asking companies for information about metrics and targets is to understand their performance in relation to risks and opportunities, and to understand their progress towards any targets. So A and B strictly are the correct answers here. So well done to all of you. Most people absolutely correct. So we're going to move on now. I think we're moving on to the last part of the Align module. We've covered all the core content disclosures that meet the ISSB standards. We've said everything we need to say for now about strategy, governance, risk management, and metrics and targets. So now we're going to move on to have a quick look at, well, what happens if you want to or have to conform with disclosure requirements in addition to the ISSB standards? What do you do? This will cover some ground that we have looked at earlier, so I'll go through it fairly quickly. But companies either have to or might want to make additional disclosures beyond the ISSB standards because they're required to by local requirements or listing requirements that listed and non-listed companies might have to conform with, and also companies in your supply chain might have to conform with. There might be policy objectives that influence what you want to or have to disclose, maybe in response to something like incentives or tax cuts or subsidies to encourage sustainable practices or to discourage them. There may be disclosures you want to or have to make in alignment with industry standards from a trade body, for example, like Jarlath mentioned earlier. Or you might want to or choose to make disclosures in addition to IFRS baseline disclosures because they satisfy the needs of other stakeholders, perhaps something you've identified through stakeholder engagement. So let's just look for a moment about what's happening with the adoption of IFRS standards. So the process used for these standards is that the ISSB makes the standards and then individual countries, individual jurisdictions decide whether, how, and to what extent they are going to adopt them into their national laws. So what you see on the screen here is that these jurisdictions, in fact, more than 20 jurisdictions, have already decided to use or are taking steps to introduce ISSB standards into their legal or regulatory frameworks. And together, these jurisdictions account for around 55% of global GDP, 40% of global market capitalization, 50% of global GHG emissions. Now, there's more information about the regulatory implementation program on the IFRS website, and I think we're going to give you, yes, Tiffany's just given us a link to that information in the chat box. So as well as the work that's going on with jurisdictions about adoption of the standards into national regulatory or other frameworks, the IFRS is supporting other stakeholders in their work to create or enhance interoperable standards, i.e. those that can be used in association with, in addition with, to enhance, to help the ISSB standards. So CDP, for example, has used the ISSB's climate standard as the foundational baseline for their climate disclosure questionnaire. With the GHG protocol, which is an initiative of the World Resources Institute and World Business Council for Sustainable Development, there are governance arrangements in place so that the ISSB will be actively involved in updates to the GHG corporate standard, which is the one that you are required to use for calculating GHG emissions. I think we mentioned earlier that GRI is, has committed to deliver full interoperability with the ISSB standards by jointly identifying and aligning common disclosures. So we have a seamless reporting system. We said earlier, IFRS Foundation has taken over disclosure aspects of the Transition Plan Task Force work. Now, somebody asked a question about this earlier. The ISSB is considering how it can build on the recommendations of the task force on nature-related financial disclosures as it develops its work on standards for biodiversity, ecosystem and ecosystem services disclosures as announced on its website. So just to say something a bit more about ISSB and GRI, because when we saw earlier, many of you described that you said that you were using the GRI standards. There's actually a specific document which you see on the left-hand side and is linked in the course materials, which talks about this joint commitment to align disclosures. The document you see is actually describing how climate disclosures are aligned, the extent to which they're aligned. And as we've just mentioned, there's a collaboration, a memorandum of understanding to deliver full interoperability with GRI's standard on biodiversity and to link that to the ISSB's project on biodiversity ecosystems and ecosystem services. And finally, the IFRS Foundation is a convening partner of GRI's Sustainability Innovation Lab in Singapore. Now, many companies are subject to the requirements of the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. The standards that are to be used for conformance with the European law, the CSRD, are European sustainability reporting standards, and they are set by a body called IFRAG. So many people are asking, well, what if I have to respond to the European law because it does apply to companies outside Europe in some cases, and what if I have to apply the IFRS standards too? Well, the simple message from this slide is that the two organizations, the IFRS Foundation and the standard setter for European Sustainability Reporting Standards, are working really closely to ensure maximum interoperability. And at the bottom of the slide, you can see a link to an interoperability guidance that the organizations have jointly released. But what they have done is work on climate disclosures, and what they find is a high degree of alignment on climate disclosures. For example, there's an aligned definition of CO2 equivalent from the GHG protocol. There is aligned wording on what's meant by anticipated financial effects. And there's a great deal of sort of reciprocity between the standards, but including on things like industry-based disclosures. So there will be companies who will be required to or choose to do both, but the alignment between the two helps. Now we're just going to go on to have a quick look at integrated reporting, because actually, if I remember rightly, this was the second most commonly used standard that our lovely participants today are applying. So the integrated reporting framework is a principles-based guidance for reporting structure and content. And as you saw earlier, the Integrated Reporting Council has been consolidated into the IFRS Foundation. So the high-level message here is that the Integrated Reporting Framework and IFRS S1 and S2 are complementary tools and are highly aligned. But the document you see on the left-hand side here, to which we'll provide a link shortly, is actually a very useful document to show you how integrated reporting can be used to support your ISSB disclosures. The integrated reporting framework gives you a way of having a holistic view of your value creation process and helps you develop a more complete picture of how value is created over time. So there's a clear fit between the two, and there are more resources on the IFRS Foundation website about how to use the integrated reporting framework effectively to help with your sustainability disclosures. And I think we're going to end this little session, this part of the session, with a Zoom poll. So the question is, and I think you only choose one here. Yes, you just choose one. My disclosure objectives should consider the ISSB standards only, the ISSB standards and regulatory requirements, just regulatory requirements, or all of the above and other sources of guidance. Yes, there's a clear pattern emerging, so I think we're going to end the poll there and thank all of you who participated. Of course, gold stars all round, you're all correct. The final answer is the one we wanted. When you are considering your disclosure objectives, of course, there will be multiple things you take into account that include the ISSB standards, regulatory requirements, and other sources of guidance. So well done, everyone. And I'm going to hand back to Tiffany to take us through a summary of the module we've just completed.
Great. Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting myself. That takes us to the end of module 2. So well done, everyone. That was a big chunk of our training today. And it did get us to the summary. So hopefully you were paying good attention throughout. But before we wrap up, let's just take a minute to remind ourselves a bit of what we learned. It was a long module, this one. So we took you through all 4 core content areas of the ISSB standards, S1 and S2. But important thing to remember is that in reality, these areas do not operate in silos or separately. Last module, we introduced the connectivity as a core concept. And we saw in our examples today that despite having 4 separate categories of disclosures, they are all really mixed in reality and quite interconnected. We also discussed how your disclosure might go further beyond the requirements of S1 and S2, which might be to meet different stakeholder needs, to meet regulatory requirements in certain jurisdictions, or to meet industry standards. So what's important to remember when doing that, as we reminded you also in module 1, is that the ISSB standards have been purposefully developed to act as a baseline. And the building blocks approach allows report preparers to then add additional disclosures on top of that. But in doing so, report preparers need to be careful not to obscure the requirements of S1 and S2. Now, as I mentioned in the chat, we will discuss briefly now the homework activity again. Remember, in the first part of the homework activity, we were really looking at the people in the organization and the skills gap that we want to make sure we're filling. But now we want to look at the actual content of disclosures and a gap analysis of that content. So a few tips on how to get started is, of course, making use of the toolkit and the SSE gap analysis checklist as you want to assess kind of what might be missing. And of course, comparing it to the standards. You can't get around reading those standards. So do take a look at those standards. And then identifying, pardon me, what additional enhancements or additional reporting requirements you might be required to determine kind of where you are now and where you need to be. So let's take a moment together and look at, if I can do this. Sorry, my computer seems to not be working great. There we go. I'm going to share again this Menti, which some of you have already been filling out. So the question I asked you already, some of you in the chat have seen that I'd asked that already. What tools can you use to identify the gaps in sustainability related financial information in your current disclosures? So we've got quite a few answers already. If you haven't responded, feel free to share your thoughts using this QR code, or you can use the link in the chat, or just go to the old browser you had open with the last one, and the new question will be appearing there. But we see some of the questions here are looking at areas not historically reported on, certainly. Of course, you want to fill those gaps. You can use, as someone said, the gap analysis checklist, and we'll share that again for you. We also see here using frameworks like GRI, SASB, and TCFD. Definitely, and as we've shared, all of those have been mapped now also to the ISSB. So if you are already using any of those frameworks for your reporting, you're well on your way. So make use of those mapping documents that are available and that help you to identify what might be missing. Someone says review existing oversight committees on sustainability, ascertain if there is a dedicated staff for sustainability, the knowledge, skills, and competence levels. Yeah, definitely. So that goes back to the people that we were talking about earlier. But indeed, a lot of our disclosure also comes back to governance. So making sure that we do have that tone from the top is also really important here. We see a lot that gap analysis checklist. I see here IFRS S1 and S2 reporting requirements. Great answer. Yes, indeed. I think starting out with the requirements can help you understand what's needed. Good. So I think we also see GRI, scenario analysis, all great tools. If you are using any of these already, your financial audits for sure, get started with that and then look at where you need to go additionally. So for example, if you're looking at your financial audits, look at how that compares to what's required for sustainability information and what's missing. So you all have a great start now. So I think you're well on your way. I'm going to come turn the slides back on so that we can continue with our, there we go, continue with our training here. Great. And with that, I think we're coming back to Lois, who's going to kick us off on module 3. Thanks, Lois.
Thanks, Tiffany. Yes, module 3. The backbone of effective disclosure processes and practices. Now, we've up till now, we've been focusing on what it is you have to disclose. And the standards are really focused on what you disclose. I saw in the comments right at the beginning when we asked why you were participating, what you wanted to know, and many of you, as lots of our participants have in the past, have said you're looking for information on how to prepare these disclosures. Well, because the standards are really primarily focused on what to report, it is that there is some, but more limited information in the standards about how to report. But we're going to try and give you a few clues here to the extent that we can. So we're going to cover 3 things. First of all, identify. This is how to identify sustainability related risks and opportunities. Secondly, we'll look at some of the evaluation processes you might have to use in-house. And thirdly, we're going to look at how you integrate considerations about sustainability disclosure into your existing practices and processes. So let's start with how to identify sustainability related risks and opportunities. Now here, I'm going to take you through what the standards say about identifying risks and opportunities. Of course, as some of you have raised in Q&A, there will be other things you take into account, your own enterprise risk management system, and of course, as Tiffany said earlier, external sources like the World Economic Forum's annual risk report. This is about what the standard says. So, IFRS S1 asks companies to provide material information on all sustainability risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect their prospects. Similar requirements for climate in S2. So what about risks and opportunities that you need to disclose and look at other than those relating to climate? So what S1 does, it directs companies to sources of guidance that can support their identification of sustainability related risks and opportunities and what information to disclose about them. So in the first column here, how to identify sustainability risks and opportunities. The standard says that companies shall consider the applicability of the SASB standards. So they must consider and look at the applicability of the SASB standards, which are available on the IFRS website too, of course. In addition, companies may consider other materials, specifically the CDSB framework application guidance for water and biodiversity disclosures. They can look at industry practice and materials that are developed by investor-focused standard setters, those that are seeking information for an investor audience. So Let's say you've used those methods to identify your risks and opportunities, then what? Then what information do you have to disclose about them? So again, S1 says that for including climate, the company shall consider consider the applicability of the SASB standards for determining what information to disclose. They may also consider the CDSB framework application guidance, industry practice, materials of investor-focused standard setters, and GRI standards, which, although are not investor focused, contain some very useful content on what to report, and European sustainability reporting standards, again developed for multi-stakeholder audiences, but may be useful. Now, the important thing to add here is that these sources may be used to the extent that the information does not conflict with what the ISSB standards want. So in summary, S1 provides guidance from day one to facilitate reporting on all sustainability related risks and opportunities that matter to investors. Now we're going to have a look at an example now. Of course, these examples were developed before the ISSB standards were released, so please do bear that in mind. They couldn't have taken account of what we've just said, but it gives you insight into how companies identify risks and opportunities. So this is from Yara's Integrated Report 2022, and Yara is an international global crop nutrition company. And what they do is that they start at the top of the page by looking at global macro trends that inform and influence their markets' megatrends. So partly this will come from things like the World Economic Forum's risk report, but you can see that they're looking at things like the increasing urban global population, geopolitical and trade uncertainty, the need for zero and circular waste economy. So these are macro types of considerations. What they do then at the bottom of the page, bottom left, is that they sort of think about how those megatrends translate into risks and opportunities that happen within their own company. So the sorts of risks that they identify are regulatory changes, consumer demand for sustainability and optimized fertilizer use that can lead to lower fertilizer demand growth. That's one of the risks they've identified. I won't go through them all. And on the opportunity side, they're looking at things like a focus on soil health, water use and biodiversity. And this is where developing optimal fertilizer use approaches can actually present opportunities for this company. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over the next example. And we're just going to go back to looking at some of these so-called proportionality mechanisms that have been, we've referred to earlier. The thing to mention here is we're on a kind of a how-to part of our module is that the IFRS Foundation recognizes that some of these things are difficult. Even though we have plenty of sources to which the standards refer us, some of the risks are still uncertain. Some of the opportunities are still difficult to assess. The IFRS Foundation knows that, and that's why they give these so-called proportionality mechanisms to recognize that some of these things are challenging and to make sure that the costs of doing this work don't outweigh the benefits of applying the ISSB standards. So the Foundation says that in applying specific requirements, the company is required to use all reasonable and supportable information it has available at the reporting date without undue cost and effort. What is reasonable and supportable information? Well, this is information that is specific to the company, so should be known to the company, that takes account of the external environment, just as we saw in the Yara example, that includes information about past events and current conditions, again, that the company should know, and its forecasts. And in some cases, what is reasonable and supportable is specified by the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards. So they will tell you when it's fine to develop metrics, for example, in line with what is commensurate with the company's circumstances. So I'm going to hand over to Tiffany to take us through the next part of the module.
Great. Thanks so much, Lois. Okay. So now we're into the second unit of implement. So we're going to just discuss now how you can go about evaluating the risks and opportunities in testing resilience. Great. So to help investors to understand a company's resilience against climate and sustainability risks, the standards do require, specifically in S2, that a company disclose information about the implications of climate change on its strategy and business model. And it also asks for the company's financial and operational capacity to adjust or adapt over the short, medium, and long term. We introduced this briefly in the previous module when we were talking about the strategy component, but let's go a little bit more in detail now as we're talking about the actual practices in place. So as an example, you might test your company's resilience against new regulation to limit certain high emission activities, or perhaps your company's ability to respond to changing crop yields, as an example, due to more frequent heat waves. And a scenario analysis can be used to do this, but it does not require you to predict the future. It's actually a tool to test your resilience against potential future events. S2 does not specifically indicate which scenarios a company shall use in its analysis, but it does require a company to use relevant scenarios and to provide information about the scenarios that it's selected, and to provide information about other relevant assumptions it has used in the scenario analysis. And S2 includes guidance on how a company can determine its approach to a scenario analysis. And this encompasses a range of practice from qualitative scenario and narratives to complex statistical and modeling. So consider considering this ISSB has decided to require a company to use an approach that is commensurate with the company's circumstances, and to use all reasonable and supportable information that is available to the company at the reporting date without undue cost or effort. So let's use an example now to add some color to that. This one's from Cemex, which is a Mexican multinational building materials company that's active in over 50 countries around the world. Cemex also used here a scenario analysis, and in its integrated report, it illustrates how it combines this analysis with its assessment of progress against its stated policies, its SDG commitments, and its net zero targets. So this table you can see here describes risks in the top half, and on the bottom half it has opportunities. And they also include in a table in the page before this where they outline these three scenarios that were used, including the source, the temperature range, reference temperature scenario, as well as the main assumptions for each scenario. So remember, when using a tool like a scenario analysis, it's important that investors understand exactly how you're using that tool and what assumptions you're using. So I think what's interesting about this disclosure example is that overall, they've actually identified by using different scenarios that opportunities for their business greatly outweigh the risks. Also, it's really important to make sure that all of your commitments, policies, practices, etc., make sense and align together. So we can see quite clearly here that the company's SDG, or Sustainable Development Goal alignment, its net zero targets, and its risk management are all working together, not against each other. So this also prevents duplication of practices. Now, anticipating the materiality of future events can be particularly challenging when first getting started on this. So to help with this determination, IFRS S1 asks that you consider a number of issues to help you with your determination. So you could think of this as a list of identifying all the steps and information you need to come to your materiality judgment. So for example, companies should be considering all low probability but high impact events. Also, any uncertainty related to the company's future cash flows should be evaluated, for example. And another important point here is the need to reassess at each reporting period. So you can make use of this slide as you're starting to look at what to disclose and what material risks and opportunities to be included here. Now, I'm going to pass back to Lois. He's going to take us through the last unit of this module. Thanks, Lois.
Thank you, Tiffany. Now what we're going to look at is how to integrate sustainability-related disclosure considerations into either your existing processes or that need to be taken into consideration to develop new processes. And I think the document that I linked us to earlier for the integrated reporting document, it's actually got a nice tip in there. And it says, actually, when companies start looking at what they need to do, they find they've already got a lot of processes already in place that they can use to develop their sustainability disclosures. So I certainly hope that's the same for all of you. But here we have a list of considerations that you might want to take into account when creating new processes and practices or adjusting what you already have. So a company's management should assess existing systems and processes to determine whether they are suitable or whether something new is needed. And in doing so, they can consider conducting a gap analysis to check for gaps in existing systems and processes. That this could apply, say, to governance. You know, is there something that you need to add to your existing governance process? Maybe in the skills section. You know, do new skills need to be added to your governance body? Secondly, consider the suitability of your existing processes. So, as we said earlier, sustainability-related risks and opportunities can materialize over different and uncertain timeframes. So is there something you need to do about your existing processes to cater for the longer timeframes over which you need to consider these risks? Similarly, on the third point there, might need to take into account different criteria, not just likelihood and probability, but also perhaps impact, vulnerability, and speed of onset of the particular risks as criteria that will help you analyze, assess, and prioritize risks. Then in the middle of the list here, we have, well, what internal risk control frameworks do you have, and how can they be applied to your sustainability disclosure requirements? Then what contributors might be needed from different departments and internally and externally to help with sustainability disclosures, and what processes do they already have that can help with the development of your disclosures? There might be a risk register, for example, and that could contain useful information. What are the interconnections between these different internal and external factors? We saw that with the Yara example, where they've taken external factors and they thought about what that means for them internally. How did they interconnect them? And there will be interconnections between internal departments as well, most likely. Then you have to consider how you're going to deal with uncertainty. What will be the process for dealing with uncertainties related to sustainability-related risks and opportunities? And finally, what resources do you have? What have you allocated, or what are needed to manage these existing or new systems and processes that will support your disclosure? So a little list of things to consider. Now we're going to move on to thinking what you can do about this, how you can consolidate some of the findings and decisions from that list into what we're describing as a disclosure plan. So a disclosure plan can be a standalone or part of a wider disclosure strategy document. And what it does, it enables you to take control of your narrative. And what I mean by that is not unilaterally decide what you're going to disclose, but recognize that the ISSB standards ask about your strategy, your risks, your business model, the metrics that you use for assessing and monitoring risks and opportunities. So it's just important to make sure that the disclosures are linked to what is happening within your company and show your narrative. The disclosure plan also supports this internal collaboration, knowledge sharing and cross-functional team discussion that we've just looked at in the list on the last slide. So who is going to be involved? How are they going to share knowledge? How will their processes interact? When will they meet? All this type of thing can be actually noted down in a disclosure plan. And then lastly, it creates a reference point or an audit trail showing things like where and how you made judgments and decisions in the past. And what this disclosure plan means is that when you get to the new reporting year, you've had a little rest between the last reporting period, the new reporting year, you can go back to it and have a look at who was involved, how they worked together, which processes you used, what decisions were made, what judgment mechanisms were used, and so what sign-off processes were there, how uncertainty was dealt with, what audiences you were dealing with. There's a lot of things that you can list in a disclosure plan that give you some consistency of disclosure from year to year. This is becoming a bit more common with companies, and this is a bit of an old example from 2022, but this is an example of the sorts of things that a company called Hammerson, which is a property company in the UK, disclose. What's important to note here is that they are mentioning they're describing the basis on which they have made their disclosures about their environmental and social impacts of their business activities. They state the period to which the disclosures apply. They state the approach that they've used for data collection and verification. They state the boundaries of the company that they're reporting for, and you know, how they have prepared their report. So you can see that they say in the bottom paragraph on the right hand side that they meet the core requirements of GRI standards, for example. So it just sets out their workings, really. That's what they're disclosing here. So let's have a look at a Zoom poll, and you can only select one answer here. Is a disclosure plan required by the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards? Must you have a plan and disclose your plan? Yes or no? We're running to time, so I'm just going to give you a second to think about this. Right, we see a pattern emerging here, so we're going to stop the poll and share the results. So 68% of you said, yes, you must disclose your plan. And 32% of you said no. Well, the answer is no. You do not have to have a disclosure plan, and you do not have to provide information of a disclosure plan, but it is a very helpful tool. So I can understand, though, why 68% of you said yes, because it is helpful. And in fact, there are places in the standard where you are required to disclose the methodology you've used for calculating GHG emissions, for example. But strictly, it is not a requirement of the IFRS standards that you have a plan or you disclose a plan. But we have recommended it for your homework because we think it is a very useful tool to keep a running record of what you're doing and how you're doing it. So don't worry, though, about this answer, because in fact, most of the participants that we have worked with over the last year give the same answer as you. So not to worry. But now you know it's not a requirement. So I'm going to hand over back to you, Tiffany. Oh,
Not yet. You have one more poll.
oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, that's right. I forgot we had another poll. But having established you don't need a disclosure plan, if you do choose to have one, what can it help you to do? You can select all that apply to take control of your narrative within general purpose financial reports. I think the poll is open, isn't it, Tiffany? I can't see it, but secondly, to support collaboration, knowledge sharing, and teamwork. Third, to act as a reference point and audit trail. Or fourth, to skip full disclosure as prescribed by the ISSB.
If you can't see the answers, Lois, I don't want to jinx it, but nobody has picked the incorrect one.
Okay, yeah, they all know. They all know that it's A,
We'll
B.
share the results.
Yeah, we don't need to tell them. Thanks, Tiffany. Oh, back to you. Well
Great.
done, everyone.
Thanks, Lois. So good to see that everybody was following along on that. Let's just do a quick review of that module before we move on to the last one. So just to remind ourselves of a few key things from this quick module. Firstly, let's come back to those connections. So in the last module, we wrapped up by highlighting the importance of connections between the 4 core content areas of disclosure. We then learned in this module that there are many connections as well between a company and its internal and external environment. So these connections are what we need to focus on to identify key risks and opportunities. And the second thing we discussed in this module was related to evaluating those risks and opportunities. And a key component of that evaluation is consistency in your assumptions. So using a scenario analysis can be a very helpful tool as it helps keep track of those assumptions. And if you're new to this, pre-packaged scenarios, such as those from NGFS, can even provide you with the assumptions that can be used for evaluation of financial effects. And finally, as we've seen, even if some of this data is not data you're already disclosing, you may already be collecting it for different reasons, or you may have the appropriate practices or processes in place to collect the data you want to report. So you just might need to make slight adjustments, not, start whole new processes and practices. So don't start from scratch if you don't need to. Now, I did share in the chat the next Menti, the next homework activity you have for this third module is understanding how you can identify which of those gaps that you had previously identified require new processes or practices in place to achieve your disclosure objectives, and which can be adapted from existing processes and practices. So a little hint on data collection and data management is to first identify how you can collect the data that is not being collected, but is required by the standards, and then identify what teams are responsible for managing this data. And to get you thinking about how you're going to deal with data and data management, we ask you what existing systems of processes for data collection can be adapted. So let's go back to that Menti. Great, and a few of you have already started entering some answers. This one answer is hidden, but I'm going to hide the QR code just for a second because great answer. Utility bills, supplier bills, fringe benefit records. Yeah, really great answer there. A lot of this information you might have already, but you might not be reporting it because you haven't identified previously the financial implications or the sustainability related information. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Trying to get you back the QR code here. There we go. Other great answers here is, well, we see quite a few surveys, forums, questionnaires. You might already be using that, for example, for stakeholder analysis and speaking with your stakeholders. So indeed, you can integrate new questions into those forums or surveys and have conversations with your stakeholders that way. Indeed, bills or sales data. We see key everything in a spreadsheet is still the best. So some people are still using spreadsheets, but as the data gets a lot bigger, we're going to see other practices, ERM services, data management tools. For example, in the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about XBRL. There's various tools that you can use that you might already be using for your financial information, and that you can adapt also here. So I think you all have a good start to that. So I'll bring us back then to our slides. Great. And that brings us actually to our final module. And I'm going to pass over to Jarlath to kick off and I think take us through this whole module. Over to you, Jarlath.
Thanks, Tiffany. Thanks, everyone. Well done. We're nearly there. Last module. So this is a little bit easier than maybe some of the other modules, and particularly for those of you who are familiar with preparing reports. So let's now look at how do we ensure efficient disclosures when we're preparing the information and beginning to disclose or get ready for disclosure. We'll talk about three areas like the other modules. There's three elements, and we're going to start with location and timing. Sorry, my mouse is a bit slow. Sorry, my my slides have gone a bit wrong. 1 second. So the first part here is about we call it about the holistic reporting package, and one of the questions, or one of the areas of interest to preparers is how do the ISSB standards align with, for example, GRI standards, and we've already talked a little bit about interoperability early on. Lois and Tiffany spoke about this, and it's important maybe just to spend a minute or two thinking about this in a little bit more detail. So the requirements in the ISSB standards about what information to report are largely based on existing sustainability reporting regimes, which focus on investor information needs and on aspects of financial accounting standards. ISSB and GRI reporting standards share some common requirements. So, for example, what to report, and we've already talked about greenhouse gas emissions today. But the ISSB standards are focused on investors' information needs and their decision making, and in particular, information about risks and opportunities that could affect companies' financial prospects. Both organizations take different approaches to defining materiality, but they're not competing. The GRI approach is set out and is well understood by sustainability practitioners, and the IFRS approach is likewise familiar to the accounting profession and relies heavily on management judgment, which aligns with existing corporate risk management processes. And this can lead to some confusion. And yes, of course, some of the impacts which you might identify as material may also create sustainability risks. And these could be so significant that they're also of interest to some of your investors. And investors, it's not easy to group investors together as a single category, and inevitably they will have different interests. But some of the key areas of interest or focus for investors, for example, include how the company is monitoring its effects of environmental degradation and social challenges in terms of the inputs that the company needs for what it does, and in particular the key relationships and key risks and opportunities it faces. And this is simply because your organization, your company does not control these things. It does not control the input of resources and the key relationships. And therefore, if they are outside of the company's control, should those dependencies and inputs change, that presents risks to investors. And as a result, how companies monitor and manage these sustainability related risks and opportunities can be quite important. And likewise, the kinds of assets the company holds and whether they're at risk of potentially becoming stranded is again another kind of risk that some investors will be quite interested in. And as a result, and again, we've made this point already, as a result, these are the reasons why disclosures around governance and strategy and resilience, for example, are so important for a company to make in a transparent way. Well, we've talked a little bit about materiality already, and given that we hear different references to types of materiality with different reporting standards and frameworks, let's briefly review here what we mean by material information. And that is used by the IFRS Foundation, and that is material information, or information is material rather, when it can influence decisions of investors and inform their decision making about, for example, providing resources to a company, buying or selling or holding equity and debt instruments in that company, and also loans and other forms of credit. And consider the characteristics of investors and the company's own circumstances. Different investors, as I said already, different investors will have different and sometimes conflicting information needs. Sustainability-related financial disclosures are intended to meet the common information needs of investors. They might not meet everyone's need, but they are designed to meet a common need for information. Companies shall ensure that material information is clearly identifiable and that you use plain language. And this is set out quite clearly in the requirements. You have to ensure the information is clearly identifiable. And so, for example, you should not disperse information that is material throughout your annual report or your disclosure. You should not hide it in your annual report. Companies might also be required to make additional disclosures by regulators in their jurisdiction, and any information that isn't material or that is required locally should be distinguished from material information to which it relates. And I think that takes us on to a Zoom poll. So the question is, information should be disclosed in the annual report when applying the ISSB standards if information should be disclosed in the annual report when applying the ISSB standards if, and there's three options, and you can pick more than one. The first one is omitting that information could reasonably be expected to influence investors' decisions. The second one is it could reasonably be expected to affect the company's cash flows. And the third one is it exemplifies the values of the leadership team. So this one is a little bit trickier than some of the other ones. Information should be disclosed in the annual report when applying the ISSB standards if A, omitting that information could reasonably be expected to influence investor decision making. B, it could reasonably be expected to affect the company's cash flows, or C, it exemplifies the values of the leadership team. Let's call it there. Okay, so A and B are correct. You don't need to talk about the values of the leadership team for the purposes of disclosing using the standards. unless, of course, that in itself is material for your investors. So let's move on. The next section then is about where to report your disclosures for the standards. And the requirements in the standards are quite clear that disclosures have to accompany the financial statements and be part of the same general purpose financial reporting package. However, S1 does not say where in that reporting package the information should be disclosed. And this is simply designed to allow jurisdictional specific requirements on the location of reporting. In some jurisdictions, you have to put certain information in certain places. And the ISSB standards accommodate that. Interestingly, research by WBCSD on the state of integrated reporting shows that nearly 2/3 of companies continue to put sustainability information in separate or standalone reports. However, the standards, the ISSB standards, require that information to be included in the main report. And that suggests that many companies still have some distance to go in the terms of their thinking and where they put this information. And Lois next is going to take us through an example.
Thanks, Charles. Yes, this example is about integration of information across different reporting channels and for different reporting content. So it's from one of Ayala's integrated reports. And Ayala is a Philippines-based conglomerate. They do lots of things, banks, healthcare, technology, and so on. Now, earlier we talked about integrated reporting, and I've put a link to an integrated reporting document into the chat. But what you see on the screen here from Ayala is based on what the Integrated Reporting Council fondly called the octopus diagram, which shows inputs to the business in terms of different forms of capital, financial, intellectual, human, social, and relationship types of capital. In the middle of the diagram, they show the process by which those capitals are used to create value and what this means in terms of the company's outlook, their strategy, their business model, risks and opportunities, and so on. And at the end, they show us what type of value is created from the inputs of capital and the value creation process. So this not only acts as a value creation framework, an example of how to apply the octopus diagram from the Integrated Reporting Council's framework, but is also like an index for the reader, a one-page snapshot of how different types of information are integrated into the integrated report. Because as you can see in the middle, and on the end column, you get references to the page number where this information is provided. Back to you, Jarlath.
Thanks, Lois. Now, technology is an emerging consideration for disclosures. So, for example, increasingly corporate reporting is moving from PDF reports towards information pages with structured data sets, such as those databases offered by stock exchanges, for example. A digital taxonomy provides the common elements or tags needed to make your sustainability disclosures machine readable. And this makes it easier to take a large data set, like information from an entire industry or sector, or even jurisdiction, and bring it all together to analyze it. The ISSB taxonomy reflects the requirements and accompanying materials of the ISSB standards, and this was published earlier this year. Digital reporting has a number of benefits. It makes the reported information easier to use for analysis. Like I said, data is structured in the same way across businesses in a machine readable format. Tagging information potentially allows for automated checks and consistency. More and more data collection and management systems are compatible with digital reporting taxonomies, and that helps to improve processing and report preparation. But the interesting one I find is actually that tags help, tagging and the labeling helps overcome language barriers. So for example, if you report your quantitative data in one language, someone speaking another language can also understand what that means. And the example here on the slide tries to illustrate that point. And we've sought to apply a number of mechanisms to support preparers get started with the ISSB standards. And there was a couple of questions earlier in the Q&A box on this. And one simple thing that was put in place was to adopt well-known terminology and concepts familiar to preparers, borrowing from the IASB, for example. And many requirements in S1 and S2 are to be applied proportionally. And that simply recognizes that companies will have a range of capabilities and preparedness on some of these issues. So for example, qualitative scenario analysis is permitted. And you'll see a phrase, all reasonable and supportable information at the reporting state without undue cost or effort. Or there's another one that talks about commensurate skill with skills, capabilities, and resources throughout the standards. And this is really, these are really here to help companies who are in that transition phase from what they've done historically to getting ready to disclose using the ISSB standards. And of course, there are a number of release in that transition phase, particularly in the first year where you're applying the standards. So for example, companies are able to limit their disclosures to climate in the first year and begin to report on other sustainability issues in the second year. Companies are able to provide annual sustainability-related financial disclosures in their next half-year report. So that gives them an extra 6 months rather than at the same time as the financial statements. And companies don't need to disclose information about Scope 3 or apply the GHG protocol standard if they're using a different methodology or provide comparative information in the first year of reporting using S1 or S2. Another relief allows companies to include greenhouse gas emission information from companies in their value chain who are using a different reporting cycle. We've already talked about some other sources of guidance and resources, including the SASB standards, the CDSB framework application guidance, amongst many others, which are designed to help preparers get up to speed with adoption. And these releases are designed to, as I said, to enable companies to put in place reporting packages and structures to provide high quality, decision useful information. I might also add that nobody expects perfection in your first year. Doing anything the first time is always hard, but as you go on, you'll get better, and your processes will improve. And that's the whole premise behind these releases. It's to try and give you a little bit of time and flexibility to get yourself ready. Of course, jurisdictions and regulators ultimately will decide when to mandate adoption, but the standards are effective from the 1st of January this year. And we know many companies are now preparing to report using them voluntarily. Okay, so that gets us on to the second part of this unit, and which is focusing now on ensuring efficient disclosures. And we added this section because a common comment we find from companies and preparers is the growing reporting burden. And as a former preparer myself, I do empathize with preparers on this challenge. And what we're hoping to highlight here is, if you've done it correctly, efficiencies can be made to reduce that burden. First of all, it's important to understand what effective communication looks like, and what is required. So I'm sure some of you will have seen this over the years. Sometimes companies think that if they just publish everything they've got, if they just dump absolutely everything they've got on a website or in a PDF, then everyone will be happy because they can go and find that information on the website or in a PDF. And the reporting team in a company won't be getting dozens of requests from suppliers and customers for lots of different kinds of information. However, this would be against one of the core concepts of the standards, in particular, fair representation. And that's because S1 requires information to be clear and concise. Dumping everything you've got on a website isn't going to help be clear or concise. And the clearest form a disclosure can take will depend on the nature of the information. So for example, it could be a table or a graph or a diagram and some accompanying text. To be concise, disclosures need to avoid boilerplate information. And we've all seen these over the years as well. Unnecessary duplication of information, and to use clear language. And it can be tricky. We've been talking today about a disclosure plan, and you really need to get internal alignment and agreement across your company on what exactly you're trying to include in your report and how you do that. Now, some preparers today might be thinking to themselves, okay, I understand this. This doesn't seem crazy. And they might be thinking, what is all the fuss about? And it could be that their experience focuses on standalone sustainability reports to date, or they haven't had much interaction with external audit or even the board audit committee. And so for any accountants watching, what I say is be kind to your colleagues. Help them understand the difference in rigor that's required when in terms of data collection and systems oversight and sign off for an annual report. The ISSB standards require that disclosed information has to be material, connected, and aggregated or disaggregated as appropriate. And the information also has to include comparative information and be restated as necessary. Companies must avoid unnecessary duplication and cross-referencing appropriately. And just on this cross-referencing, as you've noticed, there may appear to be some overlaps in the topics that should be discussed or addressed in disclosures. And for example, you might have the same governance approach for sustainability and climate issues. And rather than duplicate that content, you simply just cross-reference to enhance the efficiency of your disclosure. Cross-referencing should be applied consistently and transparently, and it shouldn't result in information becoming more difficult to understand. We have an example which you'll see in the slides. I'm just going to skip it now so we make sure we finish on time. And on to the final element. So this, which looks at comparative information, and an important way to build trust is to show how your data evolves over time in terms of trends and performance. But remembering it's not required in that first year. The information can be qualitative or quantitative, and like I said earlier, errors should be restated. And sometimes companies express concerns about sharing information they think is sensitive, or it could, if it's shared, it could hinder their competitive advantage. And there's more information on this in the standards, which relieve you of this obligation or requirement if you think it's a genuine issue. And finally, it's important to build confidence by providing a clear statement of compliance, and a company that complies with all of these requirements in the standards is required to make a statement of compliance. And finally, then, very finally, is simply a list of things to remember. I'm not going to read it all out. You've got it in the slides afterwards, and it's been covered today. But you've got a number of things to think about. in terms of how you prepare for the standards, what you're trying to achieve when you're disclosing, and how you try to achieve that when writing your disclosures. Tiffany, I'm going to pass back to you.
Thanks, Jarlath, and good job rushing through the last content. We were all of a sudden nearly out of time. So thanks everyone for your patience in getting through that last module, and congratulations. That's the end of the workshop today. But before we move on, let's make sure we really absorbed that in module 4. So let's do a quick recap. So first we discussed where to report information, and what was important here was the audience, or who you're reporting to. So make sure to be clear from the start who the primary user of information is, and that will help you ensure that this information is the right information for their needs. Then we discussed efficiency. And I think the key takeaway here is less is more. So the objective is not to overload investors with information. Actually, that can be kind of harmful given it could obscure the information that is actually required. So using the standards as you get started can be a good guide to make sure you are providing what information investors need, which is, of course, the purpose of the standards after all. And finally, we discussed report user confidence. So especially in the current climate of greenwashing accusations and legal battles over public statements, you want to be sure that your data is not only accurate, but that it is presented in a way that builds confidence among report users. So the reporting plan that we've been discussing can help you to do this, as if it's done well, you'll have a clear and documented process for reporting the data that investors need. Now, we're not going to have time today to go through the final activity of your homework, so that will be up to you to do on your own. But this last section was really just looking at then how do you communicate this information, and some tips we give you is particularly related to navigation techniques. So do have a think, and you can do this as you work on your activity, about what techniques you find particularly useful in a report to make it easy to navigate. But what I will draw your attention to in the Menti, and I'm going to come back to the Menti just for a moment here, if you bear with me for a second. Great. We'll come back here, and I'm going to come forward a couple slides just to get your feedback on now how comfortable you are. So at the beginning, we asked you these questions. How comfortable are you with each of these tasks? We want to know how comfortable you are now in each of these tasks. So the first being explaining to a team member what the ISSB is, the second being using the ISSB standards, and the third being developing a sustainability reporting strategy. And maybe Lois, you can share again that link. We have a few people filling that in. Great. It looks like so far we're moving up a little bit compared to last time. We hope that we have managed to build your confidence today in this training session, but also supply you with a number of resources. So the learning doesn't end here. From now, you need to continue moving forward. And you can use those slides that we shared with you, the Knowledge Hub that we're going to remind you of in a moment, and a number of other resources, the SSE Toolkit. You can use all of that to continue on your journey and learn from this. You can also review this recording. So in the next few days, this recording will be added to that same webpage where we have the slide deck handout and the homework assignment. You can also access the recording there. So appreciate everyone who fills that in for us. I'm going to go back to the slides just to close out today's session, but you can continue to fill that Menti in for those of you who have access there. There we go. Great. So with that, let's just quickly take you through the resources you have available, because we don't want to leave you just with this. We want to make sure you continue your training. The first is the homework. So don't forget to work on that. Think through how you can start to enhance or develop a new disclosure plan for your organization. Maybe work with other teams to be able to do that as well. Also make use of the IFRS Knowledge Hub. We've mentioned it a few times throughout today's training and in the Q&A. It has a number of resources already, but continually new resources are being added to this. So do make use of that resource and come back to it whenever you need in order to get support on your learning journey. Also, don't think you can get away without reading the standards. Those who haven't already downloaded the 2 standards available, S1 and S2, you can download them through the link in that slide. Also, we can share that with you in the chat in a second. Do take a look at them. They're not as scary and daunting as one might think. They're actually quite straightforward. And the majority of the document is actually explanatory notes. So the standards themselves don't take up that much of the content. Great. Also, one more tool that we'd like to mention is the IFC's Beyond the Balance Sheet. This is a one-stop shop for a number of corporate governance and ESG disclosure tools and guidelines. So you can make use of that. It's free and available to all participants. And of course, the toolkit, which we mentioned at the very beginning. Now, someone just asked for a certificate. So yes, indeed, we will be sharing a link now with you. And Lois, maybe you can drop that link in the chat for everybody. But we would like you to get a certificate. So in order to get a certificate, we just need you to fill in a feedback survey. Lois might be answering questions, so I can also get that feedback survey for you. Just give me 2 seconds here. Here we go. Okay, there you go. So in the chat, you now have a link to a Google form. If you fill in that form, you'll get a certificate within a week. So please do check your junk mail if you don't see it, and if you don't get it within a week, you can email us and we'll make sure that you get it. We do require you to fill that in to just share with us your learnings in order to get that certificate, which is certified by CPD UK. For those of you who missed the link in the chat, you'll also get an email tomorrow. So 24 hours after this session, Zoom will automatically email you. And in that email, that survey link is there as well. And when you leave the session today, it'll also pop up on your screen. So you should be able to have no problem filling out that feedback survey. Now, before we close off today, just a big thank you to all of our official supporters. These are stock exchanges and other organizations that provide a voluntary financial contribution to the SSE and make all of our training possible and free of charge. And of course, we thank all of our partners who've made this training possible. Thanks kindly to the IFRS Foundation for joining us today, to both Bella and Jarlath for all their help in making this possible, and to the IFC. And of course, this wouldn't have happened without our lovely host, the Ghana Stock Exchange. So thank you so much to the whole team, and Diana and Frank and the team for making this possible. Thanks, everyone. I think that brings us right to the last minute. So we'll leave this open for a minute just in case there's any last minute questions, but wish you all a fantastic evening. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany.
Thanks, Diane.